What exactly do you think you're doing in this line, young man? The TSA agent's voice cut through the ambient noise of Chicago O'Hare's Terminal 3, drawing curious glances from nearby travelers. 10-year-old Elijah Jackson didn't flinch. He simply looked up, met the agent's eyes, and calmly replied, "I'm in the priority boarding line, sir. I have a first-class ticket." His voice steady, neither defensive nor confrontational, just matter of fact. The morning sun streamed through the massive windows, casting long shadows across the polished floors as travelers rushed to gates. Elijah stood out, not because he was doing anything unusual, but because of the unusual composure with which he did it. His navy blazer and crisp white shirt contrasted with the casual attire of most passengers. His carry-on, a sleek, high-end piece, rolled behind him with practiced precision. A child traveling alone in first class? The incongruity triggered an immediate skepticism, but there was something else. Something about the way he carried himself, the self-possession in his eyes that seemed almost challenging to her. He didn't look uncertain or deferential, the way she expected children to look. He looked entitled. The word formed in her mind with all its negative connotations, though if pressed, she wouldn't have been able to explain why a composed, well-dressed child should be seen as entitled rather than well-raised. Behind Elijah in the boarding line, William Hayes watched with the situational awareness honed by 2 tours in Afghanistan. The former Marine Corps captain noticed Rachel's expression change as the boy approached, subtle but unmistakable. Hayes had seen that look before, both overseas and back home. It was the look of someone making assumptions based on the wrong criteria. The cognitive dissonance between your family situation and your actions toward Elijah Jackson suggests underlying issues that might be mitigating factors in sentencing. Rachel barely heard him, lost in the abyss of self-recognition. The mirror she had avoided looking into directly for so long had finally cracked, revealing a reflection she could no longer deny or rationalize away. "I want to apologize to him," Rachel said suddenly. "To Elijah. I need to tell him I'm sorry." Powell shook his head firmly. "That's not possible at this stage. Any communication with the victim could be construed as witness tampering or intimidation. If we reach a plea agreement, a formal apology might be part of the sentencing phase, but direct contact is out of the question." The door opened and an FBI agent appeared. "Mr. Powell, we need Miss Bennett for formal processing now." Rachel stood on unsteady legs, the reality of her situation finally fully settling in. This wasn't a bad dream or a misunderstanding. This was her new reality. Federal charges, public condemnation, family dissolution, all stemming from a moment when she had allowed her unexamined prejudice to overcome her professional training and basic humanity. As the agent led her from the room toward the processing area, where she would be fingerprinted, photographed, and officially entered into the criminal justice system, Rachel Bennett finally understood something fundamental. Her life would forever be divided into before and after that moment on Flight 307, when she had revealed who she truly was, not just to the world, but to herself. The federal courthouse in downtown Chicago was filled to capacity, the tension in Courtroom 302 palpable as the proceedings began. 3 weeks had passed since the incident on Flight 307, and today marked the formal plea hearing for Rachel Bennett. U.S. District Judge Eleanor Hamilton presided with the gravitas of her 27 years on the bench. At 65, her reputation for both fairness and firmness had made her the natural choice for a case that had captured national attention and raised fundamental questions about racial bias in commercial transportation. United States versus Rachel Bennett, the court clerk announced. Case number 23 CR 475. Rachel stood beside her attorney, James Powell, her appearance markedly different from 3 weeks ago. The airline uniform was gone, replaced by a conservative navy pantsuit. The confident posture had been replaced by a visible weight on her shoulders. The bright blonde hair was now pulled back in a simple ponytail, no makeup concealing the dark circles under her eyes. Assistant U.S. Attorney Michael Donovan represented the government, his tall frame and measured delivery projecting authority without aggression. Your Honor, we've reached a plea agreement with the defendant. Ms. Bennett has agreed to plead guilty to one count of assault on a minor in a federally regulated space. Judge Hamilton nodded. And the hate crime enhancements? After careful consideration and consultation with the victim's family, the government has agreed not to pursue hate crime enhancements in exchange for Ms. Bennett's guilty plea and her commitment to participate in educational initiatives about bias in customer service. This revelation caused a stir in the courtroom. The decision to drop hate crime enhancements, which could have significantly increased Bennett's sentence, suggested the Jackson family was indeed more focused on structural change than maximum punishment. The gallery was filled with journalists, legal observers, airline representatives, and civil rights advocates. In the front row sat Dr. Amara Jackson, her posture perfectly straight, her expression impassively professional. Elijah was not present. His parents had been adamant about shielding him from the proceedings. Beside Dr. Jackson sat Alexandra Rivera, the family's lead attorney, whose reputation had only grown in the weeks since filing what legal analysts were already calling a revolutionary civil rights lawsuit against American Airlines. Ms. Bennett, Judge Hamilton addressed the defendant directly, before I accept your plea, I need to ensure you understand the charges against you and the rights you are waiving by pleading guilty. Do you understand that by pleading guilty, you waive your right to a trial by jury? Yes, Your Honor, Rachel replied, her voice barely audible. And do you understand that the maximum penalty for assault on a minor in a federally regulated space is 3 years imprisonment and a fine of up to $250,000? Yes, Your Honor. Judge Hamilton continued through the standard colloquy, ensuring Rachel fully understood the implications of her guilty plea. When the formalities were complete, she asked, "How do you plead to the charge of assault on a minor?" Rachel's voice cracked as she responded, "Guilty, Your Honor." "The court accepts your plea," Judge Hamilton stated. "Sentencing will be scheduled following completion of the pre-sentencing report." What happened next was unexpected. Judge Hamilton removed her glasses and addressed the courtroom directly. "Before we conclude today's proceedings, I believe it would serve the interests of justice for Ms. Bennett to hear directly from Dr. Jackson regarding the impact of this incident. While victim impact statements are typically reserved for sentencing, the unique circumstances of this case, particularly the educational component of the plea agreement, warrant this departure from standard procedure." She turned to Dr. Jackson. "Dr. Jackson, would you like to address the court?" Dr. Amara Jackson stood, her white lab coat over professional attire suggesting she had come directly from the hospital. Her presence commanded immediate attention, the composed dignity of someone accustomed to making life-or-death decisions in operating rooms. "Thank you, Your Honor," she began, her voice clear and steady. "I speak today not just as Elijah's mother, but as a surgeon who has spent my career healing injuries, both visible and invisible." She turned slightly, addressing Rachel directly rather than speaking to the judge. "Ms. Bennett, the bruise you left on my son's face has faded. The physical mark is gone, but other injuries remain. Injuries to his sense of safety, to his understanding of justice, to his belief in the fundamental dignity all humans deserve, regardless of their skin color." Rachel visibly flinched at these words but maintained eye contact, tears streaming silently down her face. "My son is 10 years old," Dr. Jackson continued. "At 10, he already has protocols for documenting racial discrimination. At 10, he already knows to maintain his composure when adults question his right to exist in spaces where his documentation confirms he belongs. At 10, he has already learned that his dignity will be conditional in ways his white peers will never experience." The courtroom was absolutely silent, the weight of her words settling over everyone present. What you did to Elijah wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a pattern, both your personal pattern of treating passengers of color differently and a broader societal pattern that forces Black children to develop adult coping strategies for navigating spaces where their presence is questioned simply because of how they look. Dr. Jackson's voice remained steady, but the controlled emotion behind her words was evident to everyone present. The physical assault was the culmination, not the entirety, of what happened on Flight 307. The repeated questioning of his documentation, the implied accusations, the fundamental challenge to his belonging, these were all violations that preceded the moment your hand struck his face. She paused, allowing these words to register fully. Our family has resources most people don't. Elijah has parents who can remove him from school for therapy appointments, who can hire attorneys to pursue justice, who can leverage privilege to create accountability. But what about the countless children who experience similar treatment without those resources? Who documents their injuries? Who ensures accountability when they're harmed? Dr. Jackson straightened her shoulders slightly before delivering her conclusion. That is why our focus isn't on maximizing your punishment, but on transforming the systems that enabled your behavior. That is why we've supported a plea agreement that includes your participation in educational initiatives, because your experience, properly contextualized, might help prevent others from causing similar harm. She turned back to face Judge Hamilton. Your Honor, our family doesn't seek vengeance. We seek transformation, not just of one individual or one airline, but of the structures and systems that allow racial bias to persist unchecked until it escalates to violence. The plea agreement represents a step toward that transformation. As Dr. Jackson returned to her seat, Judge Hamilton nodded thoughtfully. Thank you, Dr. Jackson. Ms. Bennett, do you wish to address the court? Rachel stood slowly, her legs unsteady. Powell had advised her to keep any statement brief, to express remorse without excuses or justifications, to acknowledge harm without attempting to minimize it. Your Honor, she began, her voice trembling, I have no excuse for what I did. Elijah reached the gate agent, who scanned his boarding pass without issue. As he stepped onto the jet bridge, Hayes made a mental note to keep an eye on the situation. Something in his gut told him to stay alert. Rachel's smile tightened as Elijah approached the aircraft door. Hello there, she said, her voice shifting to a slightly condescending tone adults often reserve for children. Are you sure you're on the right flight, sweetheart? This is the New York flight. Yes, ma'am, Elijah replied politely. I'm in seat 1A. He presented his boarding pass. Rachel took the document, examining it with exaggerated care. And you're traveling alone? Where are your parents? My mother is in Chicago, and my father is meeting me in New York, Elijah answered, his voice steady and clear. In this moment, a fleeting image of her own son Tyler flashed in Rachel's mind. The pain I caused Elijah Jackson was inexcusable. The documentation doesn't lie. The videos don't lie. I treated him differently because of how he looked, because he didn't fit my image of who belonged in first class. She turned toward Dr. Jackson, though careful not to address Elijah directly, as prohibited by the terms of her release. I have biracial children, she continued, the cognitive dissonance still evident in her voice. I've confronted others for treating them the way I treated your son. The contradiction is devastating. I'm only beginning to understand the prejudice I carried while believing myself incapable of it. Rachel took a shuddering breath before concluding, Nothing I say can undo what I did. No apology can erase that moment, but I am committed to the educational component of this plea, to ensuring my experience serves as a warning rather than just a punishment. I am deeply, profoundly sorry. Judge Hamilton observed both women, the poised surgeon whose child had been assaulted, and the disgraced flight attendant whose actions had revealed biases she hadn't acknowledged even to herself. The contrast was striking, yet there was something powerful in this moment of direct accountability, this space where harm could be named without being diminished. The court will reconvene for sentencing following completion of the pre-sentencing report, Judge Hamilton announced. Ms. Bennett, you are reminded that the terms of your release prohibit any contact with the victim or witnesses. This court is adjourned. As the proceedings concluded, the two women's paths briefly crossed, Dr. Jackson standing with her legal team, Rachel being escorted out by her attorney. For a moment, they looked directly at each other. No words exchanged, but a silent recognition passing between them. Not forgiveness or reconciliation, but an acknowledgement of the truth that had been spoken in that courtroom. The beginning of accountability that might, eventually lead to healing not just for individuals, but for systems that had enabled discrimination to persist until it erupted in violence. Outside the courthouse, reporters clamored for statements, cameras flashed, activists held signs bearing slogans about justice and accountability. But inside that courtroom, something more nuanced had transpired. A recognition that true justice required not just punishment for one person's actions, but transformation of the conditions that had made those actions possible. Industry ripple effects, beyond one airline. The conference room at Delta Airlines headquarters hummed with tension as CEO Michael Anderson addressed his executive team. On the main screen, video footage from Flight 307 played silently. Amara Jackson's composed face, Rachel Bennett's loss of control, the aftermath captured from multiple angles. "This could have been us," Anderson stated bluntly, pausing the footage. "The patterns that enabled this incident at American exist in our operations too. We need to address them proactively rather than waiting for our own crisis." Around the table, executives shifted uncomfortably. Delta had initially positioned the American Airlines incident as a competitor's isolated problem. Now, 6 weeks later, with congressional hearings ongoing and regulatory scrutiny intensifying across the industry, that stance was no longer tenable. "I've authorized a comprehensive internal review," Anderson continued. "Preliminary findings indicate we've had 247 discrimination complaints in the past 3 years. Like American, we've treated these primarily as customer service issues rather than civil rights concerns." The Chief Operating Officer, Lisa Rodriguez, presented the next phase of the discussion. "We've developed a preemptive reform initiative that addresses the key vulnerabilities identified in American's operations. Implementation begins immediately with quarterly progress reports to the board." The initiative's scope reflected how thoroughly the Amara Jackson incident had transformed industry priorities. Complete overhaul of discrimination complaint processing with dedicated civil rights specialists, rather than general customer service representatives. Enhanced bias training for all customer-facing personnel, with specific modules addressing unconscious prejudice in premium cabin service. Data analytics implementation to identify potential discrimination patterns before formal complaints. Revision of performance metrics to explicitly include equal treatment indicators alongside traditional customer service measures. Creation of a passenger advocate position with direct reporting lines to executive leadership. Regular third-party civil rights audits with public reporting of results. "This is an overreaction," objected James Wilson, VP of Operations. "We're talking about millions in implementation costs for an incident that didn't even happen on our aircraft." "Is it an overreaction?" challenged Diane Freeman, recently promoted to Chief Diversity Officer with expanded authority that reflected the new industry landscape. "Or is it the bare minimum of what we should have been doing all along?" She distributed tablets containing a comprehensive analysis of their existing complaint system. "Look at the data," she continued. "Passengers of color in premium cabins are 4.6 times more likely to have their documentation checked multiple times. They're 3.2 times more likely to report being asked to veer their seat assignments. These aren't isolated incidents. They're systemic patterns we've failed to address." Wilson began to protest again, but Anderson cut him off. "This isn't a debate, James. The board has approved the initiative, and implementation begins today. The Amara Jackson incident has fundamentally altered the regulatory and reputational landscape. Either we transform proactively, or we wait for our own crisis to force change under much worse conditions." The decisive tone silenced further objections. What was striking wasn't just the specific reforms being implemented, but how thoroughly the conversation had shifted. From treating discrimination as a peripheral concern managed through public relations, to recognizing it as a fundamental operational and legal compliance matter. Similar conversations were unfolding at boardrooms across the aviation industry. United, Southwest, JetBlue, carriers that had initially distanced themselves from Americans' crisis were now implementing preemptive reforms, recognizing that the scrutiny focused on one airline today could easily shift to others tomorrow. At industry conferences, panels that would have previously focused on fuel efficiency or route optimization were now dedicated to civil rights compliance and inclusive customer service. The Airline Passenger Experience Association had established a task force specifically addressing discrimination prevention. The International Air Transport Association was developing global standards for civil rights training and complaint resolution. The transformation extended beyond commercial aviation to adjacent industries. Hotel chains were reviewing check-in procedures that had disproportionately subjected guests of color to additional verification requirements. Cruise lines were examining how cabin assignments and dining arrangements might reflect unconscious bias. Transportation providers of all types were reassessing how they identified and addressed potential discrimination. At the Transportation Security Administration, Administrator James Wilson was meeting with his senior leadership team to address findings from an internal review prompted by the Amara Jackson incident. Our data shows troubling disparities in secondary screening selections, Wilson acknowledged, reviewing statistics displayed on the briefing room screen. Passengers of color are 3.7 times more likely to be pulled for additional inspection, despite no difference in actual threat indicators. The agency was implementing enhanced oversight mechanisms, revised training protocols, and data monitoring systems designed to identify and correct potential bias in security procedures. The focus was shifting from defending existing practices to recognizing and addressing documented disparities. The landscape has fundamentally changed, Wilson told his team. We can either lead in addressing these issues or be forced to change through external intervention. I prefer we lead. Beyond operational reforms, the industry was experiencing a cultural shift in how discrimination was conceptualized and addressed. If Tyler had been standing there, her son, with his brown skin and curly hair, would she have questioned him this way? The thought surfaced just long enough to make her uncomfortable before she pushed it away. Rachel handed back the boarding pass, her smile not reaching her eyes. Well, that's unusual. Let me just double-check something before you take your seat. Elijah remained calm, though his heart rate had increased slightly. This was familiar territory. As Rachel stepped away to consult with another crew member, he glanced back at the boarding line. Several passengers were watching the interaction with varying degrees of interest. William Hayes had moved closer now, his military haircut and alert posture marking him as someone accustomed to authority. At 6 feet 2 inches, with broad shoulders and steely eyes, the 38-year-old security consultant was an imposing figure, even in civilian clothing. What had previously been treated as a public relations concern, managed primarily through communication strategies and customer service responses, was now being recognized as a fundamental operational and legal compliance matter, requiring systematic attention at the highest levels of corporate governance. This shift was evident in how industry publications covered discrimination issues. Articles that would have previously appeared in marketing or customer relations sections were now featured in legal compliance, risk management, and corporate governance contexts. The language itself was changing. Less focus on perception management, more emphasis on accountability mechanisms and verifiable outcomes. The industry was also experiencing personnel changes that reflected this new priority. Chief diversity officers were being elevated from relatively peripheral positions to core leadership roles with substantial authority over operational policies and practices. Civil rights compliance specialists were being recruited from regulatory agencies and advocacy organizations to build internal capabilities. Training departments were being restructured to integrate bias prevention throughout all customer service protocols rather than treating it as a separate module. At O'Hare International Airport, where the incident on Flight 307 had begun, a pilot program was being implemented to test new approaches to passenger service in premium cabins. The initiative, developed in consultation with civil rights organizations and customer experience specialists, focused on standardizing verification procedures to eliminate disparate treatment. The key insight, explained Program Director Sarah Mitchell during a staff briefing, is that discretionary enforcement creates the conditions for bias to influence decisions about who gets questioned and how intensively. By standardizing these procedures and monitoring outcomes for disparities, we can identify and address potential discrimination before it escalates. The technological infrastructure supporting these reforms was evolving rapidly. Software companies were developing specialized compliance platforms to help airlines track, analyze, and address potential discrimination patterns. Data analytics firms were creating tools for identifying disparate treatment indicators in customer service interactions. Training technology providers were implementing virtual reality simulations that allowed employees to experience passenger interactions from different perspectives. 6 months after the incident on Flight 307, the Federal Aviation Administration hosted an industry-wide conference on civil rights compliance in commercial aviation. What would have previously been a sparsely attended regulatory update was now the year's most significant industry event, with waiting lists for registration and simultaneous translation into 12 languages for international participants. Frank Roberts, still CEO of American Airlines despite the crisis, delivered the opening keynote. His address reflected how completely the conversation had shifted from damage control to transformation. 6 months ago, a child was assaulted on one of our aircraft for the crime of sitting in a seat he was entitled to occupy. Roberts began, the directness of his acknowledgement setting the tone for the conference. That incident exposed failures that extended far beyond one employee or one airline. It revealed systemic problems in how our entire industry conceptualizes and addresses discrimination. The most remarkable aspect of the conference was the presence of representatives from the Jackson family's foundation, civil rights organizations, and regulatory agencies alongside industry executives, all engaged in substantive dialogue about concrete mechanisms for ensuring equal treatment rather than abstract discussions of diversity and inclusion. What had begun as a crisis for one airline had evolved into a movement for fundamental change in how organizations conceptualized and addressed their responsibilities regarding discrimination. Not through awareness or intentions alone, but through specific mechanisms of accountability, verification, and consequence. 1 year to the day after Rachel Bennett's hand struck Elijah Jackson's face, the ballroom of the National Press Club in Washington, D.C., was filled to capacity. Representatives from every major airline, transportation regulatory agencies, civil rights organizations, and corporate travel departments had gathered for a momentous announcement. Marcus Jackson, impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit, approached the podium flanked by Department of Transportation Secretary Maria Rodriguez and American Airlines CEO Frank Roberts. The unlikely alliance of technology entrepreneur, government regulator, and airline executives symbolized the collaborative approach that had emerged from the crisis. 1 year ago today, Marcus began, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had built Horizon Technologies. My son Elijah experienced something no child should face: physical assault for simply occupying a seat he was entitled to. Today, we're announcing the formal implementation of the Jackson Protocol, a comprehensive framework for preventing, identifying, and addressing discrimination in commercial transportation. On the screens behind him appeared the protocol's logo, a stylized image of an open door with the words, "Dignity in Transit," beneath it. The visual identity had been carefully designed to represent the core principle, that every passenger deserved equal access and equal treatment, regardless of who they were. Secretary Rodriguez stepped to the microphone next. The Jackson Protocol represents a new approach to civil rights compliance in transportation, one that moves beyond general commitments to specific, verifiable standards with clear accountability mechanisms. She outlined the protocol's 3 core elements. 1. Prevention systems. Standardized training requirements, data monitoring tools, and operational protocols designed to prevent discriminatory treatment before it occurs. 2. Identification mechanisms, advanced analytics, reporting channels, and assessment tools to identify potential discrimination patterns before they escalate to serious incidents. 3. Accountability structures. Clear consequences for noncompliance, independent verification systems, and transparent reporting requirements to ensure sustained commitment to equal treatment. What made the Jackson Protocol revolutionary was its specificity, moving beyond aspirational statements to concrete standards with measurable outcomes. Airlines adopting the protocol committed to implementing comprehensive bias training for all customer-facing personnel, utilizing data analytics to identify and address potential discrimination patterns, establishing dedicated civil rights compliance teams separate from customer service, conducting regular third-party audits with public reporting of results, creating passenger advocate positions with direct reporting to executive leadership, revising performance metrics to explicitly include equal treatment indicators, developing streamlined not because we were perfect, clearly we were not, but because we recognize that meaningful change requires accountability, transparency, and continuous improvement. The protocol's development had not been without resistance. Behind the scenes, industry representatives had pushed back against specific requirements, arguing for more flexibility, longer implementation timelines, and less stringent reporting obligations. The Jackson team had held firm, insisting on concrete, verifiable standards rather than general commitments to improved intentions. The process was contentious at times, admitted Diana Freeman, now Executive Vice President for Civil Rights Compliance at American Airlines, in a private interview. There were executives across the industry who wanted a more symbolic approach, diversity statements, awareness campaigns, things that sound good but don't create actual accountability. "Everything okay here?" Hayes asked casually, though his eyes conveyed more to Elijah than his words. "Yes, sir," Elijah replied. "Just a routine verification." Rachel returned, her expression now professionally neutral. "Your boarding pass checks out, but it's unusual for someone your age to be in first class unaccompanied. Do you have some form of identification?" Elijah reached into his jacket pocket and produced a laminated student ID from Westridge Academy, one of Chicago's most exclusive private schools, along with his frequent flyer card showing his platinum status. "I've flown this route 6 times this year," he said simply. Rachel examined the documents with obvious skepticism. "These don't prove you belong in seat 1A. William Hayes stepped forward. "Ma'am, his boarding pass was just verified at the gate. Is there an actual safety concern here?" Rachel straightened, clearly not appreciating the intervention. The breakthrough had come when corporate travel departments, representing billions in annual spending, began incorporating protocol requirements into their vendor selection criteria. When Delta Airlines announced it would voluntarily adopt the protocol standards, competitive pressure helped overcome remaining resistance. After the formal presentations, Marcus Jackson took questions from the assembled press. A reporter from the Washington Post asked the question many were thinking. "Mr. Jackson, some critics have suggested this protocol is an overreaction to a single incident. How do you respond?" Marcus's expression remained composed, but his response carried unmistakable conviction. "What happened to my son wasn't a single incident. It was the visible eruption of systematic problems that had persisted for decades. The 7 previous complaints against Rachel Bennett that received no meaningful response. The thousands of discrimination reports across the industry that were categorized as customer service issues rather than civil rights violations. The performance metrics that inadvertently rewarded discriminatory scrutiny." He continued, his voice steady but intense. "The Jackson Protocol isn't an overreaction to one moment, but a measured response to decades of systemic failures. The fact that it took a viral video of a child being assaulted to create momentum for these changes is itself an indictment of how we've approached discrimination in commercial transportation." The protocol's implementation would be overseen by a newly established Transportation Civil Rights Commission, funded partially by the Jackson Family Foundation and partially by participating carriers. This independent body would conduct regular audits, verify compliance with protocol standards, and publish public reports on industry progress. In a quiet corner of the event space, Away from the main presentations, a small exhibit displayed artifacts from the incident that had catalyzed this transformation. Elijah's notebook, with its careful documentation of what had happened on Flight 307, the torn invitation pieces that had been preserved as evidence, photographs showing the progression of the bruise on his face over the days following the assault. These tangible reminders of what had happened to one child provided powerful context for the systematic reforms now being implemented across an entire industry. They connected institutional changes to the human experience that had necessitated them, the violation of dignity that had created the moral imperative for transformation. As the day's events concluded, Marcus Jackson offered closing remarks that captured the significance of what the protocol represented. 1 year ago, my son Elijah taught us all something profound about dignity under pressure. Today, we're transforming that lesson into systems that protect other children from facing what he faced. The Jackson Protocol isn't just about preventing discrimination. It's about creating transportation systems that recognize and respect the fundamental humanity of every passenger, regardless of who they are or where they sit. In that transformation lay the true significance of what had emerged from the crisis on Flight 307, not just policy changes or procedural adjustments, but a fundamental recalibration of what constituted acceptable practice in commercial transportation. The dignity Elijah Jackson had maintained in the face of discrimination had become embedded in systems designed to protect that same dignity for countless others, creating accountability that extended far beyond his individual experience to address the structural conditions that had enabled such treatment to occur and persist. Elijah's growth, 1 year later. The science lab at Wellington Academy buzzed with activity as 8th grade students worked in pairs on their renewable energy projects. In the center of the room, Elijah Jackson guided his partner through a complex calculation. If we adjust the angle of the solar array by 17 degrees, he explained, sketching a diagram in his notebook, we should increase energy capture by approximately 23% during peak daylight hours. At 12 years old, Elijah had grown 2 inches since the incident on Flight 307, his voice occasionally cracking with the first signs of adolescence. The physical mark of Rachel Bennett's hand had long since faded from his cheek, but other changes, less visible but more profound, remained. Miss Carpenter, the science teacher, stopped beside their workstation. Excellent optimization approach, Elijah. Have you considered seasonal variations in your calculations? Yes, Miss Carpenter, he replied, flipping to another page in his notebook where meticulous charts showed projected energy capture across different months. We've modeled output for all 4 seasons and designed an adjustable mounting system to maximize efficiency year-round. The teacher nodded approvingly before moving to the next group. Elijah's partner, Jason Chen, grinned as they returned to their calculations. We're definitely winning the efficiency competition, he said, adjusting a connection on their prototype. The familiar rhythms of middle school, project deadlines, friendship dynamics, extracurricular activities, had gradually reasserted themselves in Elijah's life after the intensity of the Flight 307 aftermath. His parents had been deliberate about creating space for normal childhood experiences amid the extraordinary circumstances. The final bell rang, signaling the end of the school day. As students packed up, Elijah carefully documented their project's status in his notebook, a habit of thorough record-keeping that predated the incident, but had taken on deeper significance afterward. Outside in the hallway, a group of 8th graders passed by, one of them calling out, "Hey Jackson, when's your next TV appearance?" The comment wasn't exactly bullying, but carried the edge of something between admiration and resentment. Elijah had grown accustomed to such remarks, the occasional reminder that his classmates hadn't forgotten his sudden fame. "Ignore them," Zoe Morris, one of his closest friends, said quietly, as Elijah continued organizing his backpack without responding. "Already forgotten," he replied, with a small smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Outside, Marcus Jackson waited in the family's electric sedan. As CEO of Horizon Technologies, his schedule was perpetually overloaded. But he and Amara had made a commitment after the incident. Whenever possible, they would personally handle school transportation rather than relying on drivers or staff. "Hey, Dad," Elijah greeted as he slid into the passenger seat. "Robotics is canceled. Can I go to Zoe's instead? They're offering their garage for us to work on our navigation system." Marcus checked his calendar before responding. "That works. I'll message Mrs. Morris to confirm. How is the solar project coming along?" "We increased theoretical efficiency by 23%, Elijah reported, his enthusiasm for the technical details momentarily overshadowing everything else. Jason figured out a material substitution that reduced heat loss significantly. As they drove through Chicago traffic, father and son discussed renewable energy technologies, circuit design optimizations, and potential applications, the comfortable terrain of shared intellectual interests that had always connected them. It wasn't until they were nearly at the Morris house that Marcus addressed what had happened earlier. "Your teacher mentioned there was an incident in the hallway today. Something about TV appearances?" Elijah's expression shifted subtly. "Just the usual comments. Nothing important. Does it happen often?" "Not really. Mostly when something about the case appears in the news again." Elijah gazed out the window for a moment before adding, "The Jackson Protocol announcement last week triggered another round of articles. Some of the kids saw them." Marcus nodded, understanding the complex position his son navigated, neither wanting special treatment nor pretending the extraordinary circumstances hadn't affected his life. "You know you can always talk to us about this," he reminded Elijah. "Or Dr. Patel, if you prefer." Dr. Patel was the child psychologist Elijah had been seeing since shortly after the incident. Not because he was traumatized in any simplistic sense, but because his parents recognized the need for professional support in processing such a public experience at such a young age. "I know, Dad," Elijah acknowledged, "but honestly, it's more annoying than upsetting. I'd rather focus on things that matter, like beating Jason's team in the science competition." The casual deflection was characteristic. Elijah had always been skilled at compartmentalizing, at distinguishing between what he could control and what he couldn't. But beneath this practical approach lay more complex emotions that occasionally emerged in his therapy sessions or late-night conversations with his parents. "Sir, I'm just following procedure for unaccompanied minors." "I'm not registered as an unaccompanied minor," Elijah corrected politely. "I'm a regular passenger with TSA pre-check and clear verification." From the second row of first class, an elderly black woman observed the exchange with narrowed eyes. Margaret Taylor, 78, had lived through segregated water fountains and whites-only signs in her childhood. She recognized what was happening immediately and quietly removed her phone from her purse, opening the camera app and positioning it discreetly. Rachel's professional veneer cracked slightly. "Look, it's just very unusual, and I need to ensure everything is in order." "What specifically seems out of order?" Elijah asked, his voice still remarkably composed. "My documentation is complete." "Just take your seat for now," she said finally. "We'll sort this out before takeoff." At the Morris house, Elijah joined Zoe and two other team members in the garage that had been converted into a makeshift robotics lab. For the next 2 hours, he was simply a 12-year-old engineering enthusiast, collaborating with friends on a challenging technical problem. These moments of normalcy, absorbed in technical challenges with friends who treated him as a peer rather than a symbol, had become increasingly precious. They provided a space where Elijah could simply be himself, defined by his interests and abilities, rather than by what had happened to him. When Mrs. Morris drove him home later that evening, Elijah found his mother in her home office, reviewing patient files. Dr. Amara Jackson had reduced her surgical schedule following the Flight 307 incident, prioritizing family time, while expanding her leadership role in medical education and healthcare policy. "How was the impromptu robotics session?" she asked, removing her reading glasses as Elijah settled into the chair across from her desk. "Productive. We solved the latency issue in the visual recognition system." He pulled out his notebook, showing her the algorithmic adjustments they'd made. "We should have a working prototype by next week." In his therapy sessions with Dr. Patel, Elijah had worked through complex feelings about the incident, not just the immediate trauma of being physically assaulted, but the larger questions it raised about identity, belonging, and societal expectations. Why had he needed to maintain such perfect composure in the face of adult aggression? Why had his dignity been conditional in ways other children's wasn't? These sessions had helped him develop language for experiences many children his age never had to articulate: the psychological impact of racial profiling, the burden of representing more than just himself in public spaces, the pressure to be twice as good, to be treated as equal. Dr. Patel says I'm developing healthy compartmentalization, Elijah had explained to his parents after a recent session. She says it's good that I can acknowledge what happened without letting it define me, but also without pretending it didn't matter. That balance, acknowledging impact without surrendering identity, processing trauma without being defined by it, had been crucial to Elijah's growth over the past year. With professional support and his parents' careful attention, he was navigating the complex territory between the extraordinary circumstances of his experience and the ordinary developmental tasks of early adolescence. Later that evening, as Marcus came to say goodnight, he found Elijah reading a book about quantum computing principles, advanced material for a 12-year-old, but not surprising given his interests and abilities. "Big day tomorrow with the solar project presentation," Marcus noted, sitting on the edge of the bed. "We're ready," Elijah replied confidently. "Jason and I ran the final simulations this afternoon." There was a moment of comfortable silence before Marcus addressed what had been on his mind since their earlier conversation. "You know, it's okay to acknowledge when the comments at school bother you. You don't have to be perfectly composed all the time." Elijah marked his place in the book before responding. "I know, Dad. Dr. Patel and I talk about that a lot. The pressure to always maintain dignity, even when it's hard. And sometimes it is hard," Elijah admitted. "Not because I care what those specific kids think, but because it reminds me that I'll always be that kid from the viral video to some people." Marcus nodded, understanding exactly what his son meant. Identity is complicated. We're all multiple things simultaneously, and others don't always see all of who we are. The conversation reflected how far Elijah had come in processing his experience, developing the capacity to articulate complex emotional responses, to recognize both the necessity of the composed dignity he had shown and the cost it exacted, to integrate the extraordinary circumstances of the Flight 307 incident into his developing sense of self without being reduced to them. That integration, acknowledging impact without surrendering identity, recognizing significance without accepting limitation, represented perhaps the most important aspect of Elijah's growth over the past year. He wasn't defined solely by what had happened to him, but he wasn't unchanged by it either. In that balance lay the foundation for his continued development, not just as the kid from the viral video or the boy from Flight 307, but as Elijah Jackson, a 12-year-old with interests, abilities, relationships, and aspirations that extended far beyond that single moment when an adult's prejudice had revealed itself in violence. The observation deck of Chicago's Willis Tower offered panoramic views of the city where everything had changed 2 years earlier. Elijah Jackson stood at the glass wall, gazing at O'Hare Airport visible in the distance, the starting point of a journey none of them had anticipated, but all had navigated with remarkable determination and dignity. His parents stood nearby, giving him the space to process this moment in his own way. The family had just attended the final implementation conference for the Jackson Protocol, where representatives from airlines, regulatory agencies, and civil rights organizations had documented the transformation catalyzed by what had happened on Flight 307. As the sunset painted the sky in shades of gold and purple, Elijah turned to his parents. "It's really over, isn't it?" he asked, his voice carrying both relief and a hint of wonder at everything that had unfolded from that single moment when Rachel Bennett's hand had struck his face. "The implementation phase is complete," Marcus confirmed, choosing his words carefully. "The systems are established. The accountability mechanisms are functioning. The transformation is sustainable without our direct involvement. Amara nodded in agreement. The work continues, but our role in it has naturally evolved. That was always the goal, to create change that would outlast our specific advocacy. The Jackson family had deliberately structured their response to ensure this outcome, focusing on systemic transformation rather than personal narrative, on creating accountability mechanisms rather than seeking punishment or sympathy, on establishing verifiable standards rather than general commitments to improved intentions. "How do you feel about it?" Marcus asked his son, genuinely curious about his perspective now that the intense phase of implementation had concluded. Elijah considered the question with his characteristic thoughtfulness. "Mostly relieved," he admitted. "It's good to know that what happened to me is less likely to happen to someone else. That systems are in place to identify and address discrimination before it escalates." He paused, gazing again at the distant airport. But also proud, not of being assaulted, obviously, but of how we responded to it. We didn't just react emotionally, we created actual change. The distinction was crucial. Pride, not in victimhood, but in strategic response. Not in suffering injustice, but in transforming it into catalyst for structural reform. Elijah had internalized his family's approach, developing his own understanding of how systems change occurs and what role individual experiences play in that process. "I'm proud of you," Amara told her son, resting a hand lightly on his shoulder. "Not just for how you handled that moment on the flight, but for how you've integrated the experience without being defined by it." At 13, Elijah stood at the threshold of adolescence. Already taller than he'd been 2 years earlier, his voice occasionally cracking with the first signs of maturity, his interests and perspectives evolving beyond childhood without yet reaching adulthood. The incident had accelerated certain aspects of his development, while his parents had worked diligently to protect others, ensuring space for normal growth amid extraordinary circumstances. "What happens now?" Elijah asked, the question reflecting not anxiety, but genuine curiosity about this transition in their family's journey. "Now we return to our lives," Marcus replied simply. "You focus on school, friends, robotics competitions. We continue our professional work. The protocol implementation continues without our daily involvement." "And if someone asks me about it?" Elijah pressed, knowing that despite the formal conclusion of their advocacy, the public association would likely continue. "You answer however feels right to you," Amara assured him. "You've earned that autonomy. You understand these issues well enough to navigate those conversations in your own way." As Elijah moved to his seat, a memory from just a month ago sliced through Rachel's mind. She'd been shopping with Tyler when a security guard had followed them through an upscale store, watching her son with obvious suspicion. She'd confronted the guard furiously, demanding to see a manager, insisting on an apology. "He's a child, for God's sake," she'd shouted. "What is wrong with you people?" The contradiction between that protective rage and her current behavior created a momentary dissonance that made her physically uncomfortable. She busied herself with pre-flight preparations, pushing away the unwelcome thought. "Excuse me." Rachel's voice cut through the pre-departure announcements as she approached seat 1A again. "I need to see your boarding pass and ID one more time." Elijah looked up from his notebook, his expression carefully neutral. "Yes, ma'am." He reached for his documents, which were neatly placed in the seat pocket in front of him. The trust implicit in this response reflected how thoroughly Elijah had developed his own perspective on what had happened and its significance. No longer simply repeating what his parents had taught him, but synthesizing his own understanding based on both personal experience and systematic education. As twilight deepened over Chicago, the Jackson family made their way back to street level and then home. Not to the penthouse suite where they had planned strategy sessions and legal consultations in the immediate aftermath, but to their regular residence, where Elijah had homework to complete and his parents had professional responsibilities to address. The normality of their evening routine, dinner preparation, academic discussions, Family conversations about everything from quantum computing to basketball statistics represented perhaps the most significant emotional resolution of their extraordinary journey. They had neither allowed what happened to consume their identity nor pretended it hadn't profoundly affected their trajectory. Later that evening, as Elijah prepared for bed, he found his father in the home office reviewing scientific papers. "Dad," he asked from the doorway, "do you think we made a difference? A real, lasting difference?" Marcus set aside his reading, giving his son's question his full attention. "Yes," he replied without hesitation. "The data confirms it. Discrimination complaints down 74%. Resolution times improved by 71%. Implementation rates exceeding 80% across all major metrics. But beyond the numbers, the systems have fundamentally changed. That's the lasting impact." Elijah nodded, processing this assessment. "And the next Elijah? The next kid who doesn't have billionaire parents or viral videos or media attention? Are they safer now?" The question cut to the heart of what had always been the Jackson family's primary concern. Not just justice for their son, but transformation that would protect others without his resources or visibility. "Safer, yes," Marcus acknowledged. "The protocol creates multiple layers of protection: training requirements, data monitoring systems, complaint processing procedures, accountability mechanisms. But no system is perfect, and vigilance remains essential." He continued, offering his son the honest assessment he deserved rather than false reassurance. "The transformation isn't complete, and it requires continued oversight to prevent backsliding. But the framework we've established creates substantive, verifiable standards with clear consequences for non-compliance. That's fundamentally different from what existed before." Elijah considered this, then asked one final question. "Was it worth it? Everything we went through?" Marcus didn't answer immediately, recognizing the complexity beneath the seemingly simple question. "That's ultimately for you to decide," he said finally. "No child should have to experience what you did. Nothing can fully justify that original harm, but the systems established in response will protect many others from similar treatment. There's meaningful value in that outcome, even if it doesn't erase the original harm." This balanced perspective, acknowledging both the unjustifiable nature of the original harm and the significant value of the resulting transformation, had characterized the Jackson family's approach throughout. They had neither minimized the violation nor allowed it to define their narrative, focusing instead on strategic response that created lasting change. As Chicago slept that night, the systems established through the Jackson Protocol continued functioning. Training programs implemented, data monitoring tools operating, complaint procedures processing, accountability mechanisms verifying. The transformation catalyzed by what had happened to Elijah Jackson continued unfolding, sustained now by its own momentum rather than requiring the family's direct advocacy. In that sustainability lay perhaps the most significant aspect of emotional resolution. The knowledge that what had begun with a single act of discrimination had evolved into sustainable structural change that would continue protecting others long after the specific incident that catalyzed it had faded from public memory. The dignity Elijah Jackson had maintained in the face of discrimination had become embedded in systems designed to protect that same dignity for countless others, creating accountability that extended far beyond his individual experience to address the structural conditions that had enabled such treatment to occur and persist. In that extension from individual incident to systemic change, from personal trauma to structural transformation, from momentary crisis to sustainable reform, lay the true measure of emotional resolution. Not just for the Jackson family personally, but for the countless others whose experiences would be different because of what had happened and how it had been transformed into catalyst for lasting change. If this story moved you, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more powerful narratives that explore important social issues. Your support helps us continue creating content that matters. Share this video with someone who needs to hear this message about dignity, accountability, and the power of one family's response to injustice. What moment in this story resonated with you the most? Let us know in the comments below. Around them, the cabin had settled into pre-flight routines. Most passengers were absorbed in their phones or tablets, though a few had begun to notice the repeated questioning of the young boy in the first row. "Is there a specific concern?" Elijah asked as he handed over his boarding pass and school ID for the third time. Rachel examined the documents with exaggerated thoroughness. "These still don't explain how you're in first class. Where did you get this ticket?" "My father purchased it through his corporate account," Elijah explained calmly. "As I mentioned earlier, I've flown this route 6 times this year." Margaret Taylor's phone continued recording from across the aisle, her experienced eyes recognizing a familiar pattern unfolding. She'd seen this script play out countless times in different settings. The questioning of belonging, the demand for extraordinary proof, the implied accusation. Rachel's voice took on an edge. "And you expect me to believe that? A child your age, alone in first class?" Elijah maintained his composure, though his heart was beating faster now. "My documentation is in order, ma'am. If there's a specific airline policy I'm violating, I'd appreciate knowing what it is." For a brief moment, Elijah's calm facade cracked just slightly. His lower lip trembled for an instant, his eyes blinking rapidly once, twice. He was, after all, only 10 years old, being interrogated by an adult in a position of authority. But he quickly regained control, remembering his grandmother's words about dignity being a shield. Sofia Rodriguez approached, sensing the tension. "Rachel, is everything okay?" Her voice was low, concerned. "I'm handling this, Sofia," Rachel replied sharply. "There's clearly something not right here." William Hayes unbuckled his seatbelt and leaned forward. "Ma'am, the young man has provided his documentation multiple times. What exactly is the issue?" "Sir, please stay out of this," Rachel said, not taking her eyes off Elijah. "This is a security matter." "What security concern does a 10-year-old with verified documentation present?" Hayes pressed, his military training evident in his controlled tone. Other passengers were now openly watching. Jordan Whitaker, CEO of a mid-sized tech company, had set aside his laptop, uncomfortable with what was unfolding, but still hesitant to involve himself. Rachel's frustration mounted as she felt her authority being questioned. "Look, we have procedures." "What procedures specifically?" Elijah interrupted, his voice still remarkably steady. "I'd like to know which airline policy requires triple verification of documentation after boarding." The directness of the question caught Rachel off guard. Her professional mask slipped further. "Don't get smart with me," she said, her voice rising slightly. "I'm trying to ensure everyone is where they belong." The implication hung in the air. Elijah didn't belong. "I believe I am exactly where I belong," Elijah replied, "in the seat assigned on my boarding pass, which has been verified multiple times." Rachel's face flushed. This child was making her look foolish in front of the entire first-class cabin. She glanced around, noticing the watching eyes, the judgment she felt building. In that moment, another memory intruded. Tyler coming home from school last year, quiet and withdrawn. When she'd finally coaxed it out of him, he'd told her about a teacher who had repeatedly questioned his test scores, implying he couldn't possibly have earned them honestly. "She thinks I cheated, Mom," he'd said, his voice small, "just because I got the highest grade." Rachel had been furious, had gone to the school the very next day to confront the teacher. "My son is brilliant and hard-working," she'd insisted. The TSA agent examined Elijah's boarding pass and ID with exaggerated scrutiny before reluctantly waving him through with a grunt. Elijah didn't react to the small victory. He'd been here before. As he navigated toward gate B12, his mind drifted to his grandmother's words from years ago. She'd sat him down after an incident at his private school when he was 7, the only black child in his grade, accused of stealing another student's tablet that had actually been misplaced in the library. "Remember, Elijah," Grandma Josephine had said, her hands weathered but strong around his small ones. "They'll always expect you to react, to get angry, to confirm what they already believe about you. Your dignity is your shield. They can't take it unless you hand it over. Grandma Josephine had marched with Dr. King in Selma. She still had the scar on her temple from a police baton. Document everything, she'd taught him. Your word against theirs isn't enough. Evidence is power. How dare you assume he couldn't achieve this on his own? The cognitive dissonance between that memory and her current behavior created a sickening feeling in her stomach, a sensation she immediately converted to anger rather than self-reflection. If there's no specific security concern, Elijah continued, reaching for his phone, I need to let my parents know about this delay. The movement triggered something in Rachel. She reached out suddenly, grabbing Elijah's wrist. You don't touch anything until we sort this out. The cabin went silent. William Hayes half rose from his seat. Ma'am, you need to take your hands off that child right now. Margaret Taylor's fingers trembled slightly as she continued recording, but her voice rang out clear and strong. Young man, are you all right? Elijah's composure wavered for the first time, surprise registering in his eyes at the physical contact. Please let go of my arm. His voice cracked slightly, the child beneath the composed exterior momentarily visible. Rachel didn't release him. This has gone far enough. I think you need to move to another seat while we contact your parents to verify. My seat assignment is 1A, Elijah insisted, trying to pull his arm away. You have no right to touch me. No right? Rachel's control snapped. You think you can talk to me like that? You think you're entitled to special treatment? Years of passed-over promotions, of feeling invisible, of swallowed resentments crystallized in that moment. Rachel saw in this composed, articulate black child everything she had come to resent. Privilege she felt she'd never had. Confidence she'd never been allowed. Respect she'd never been given. Sophia stepped closer. Rachel, I think we should. Stay out of this, Rachel snapped. Then, turning back to Elijah, I'm tired of people like you thinking rules don't apply. People like me? Elijah repeated, his voice finally betraying fear. What does that mean? For a fraction of a second, Rachel saw not Elijah, but her own son Tyler, with his brown skin and questioning eyes. The image was so jarring, so unexpected, that it further unbalanced her already precarious emotional state. Something in Elijah's tone, not submission, but genuine confusion and fear, pushed Rachel over the edge. Her hand moved before her mind could stop it. The sharp crack of palm against cheek echoed through first class like a gunshot. Elijah's head snapped to the side from the impact. A perfect red handprint bloomed across his dark skin. For one eternal moment, no one moved, no one breathed. Then everything happened at once. William Hayes was on his feet. That's assault on a minor. Margaret Taylor's voice shook with rage. I've got it all on video. Jordan Whitaker finally found his voice. What the hell was that? Sophia gasped, her hands covering her mouth in horror. But it was Elijah himself who commanded the moment. He didn't cry, he didn't shout, though a tear escaped down his cheek, the human, child reaction impossible to fully suppress. He straightened in his seat, looked Rachel directly in the eye, and said in a voice that carried throughout the silent cabin, My name is Elijah Jackson. My mother is Dr. Amara Jackson, Chief of Pediatric Surgery at Northwestern Memorial Hospital. My father is Marcus Jackson, founder and CEO of Horizon Technologies. That was assault on a minor, witnessed by at least 15 people, and recorded from multiple angles. I will be documenting this incident in full, including your name, employee number, and actions. With steady hands, despite the red mark blazing across his cheek and the tear track still visible, Elijah reached for his notebook and began to write with methodical precision. October 15th, 2025. Flight 307, first class cabin. Physical assault by flight attendant Rachel Bennett, employee number 4472. Time, 9:17 a.m. Witnesses, approximately 15 to 20 passengers. Rachel's face drained of color as the implications of what she'd done crashed over her like a tidal wave. In that moment of terrible clarity, she saw her own son Tyler in Elijah's place and realized with sickening certainty that she had become exactly the kind of person she had repeatedly confronted for mistreating her own biracial children. "Oh God," she whispered, her hand going to her mouth in horror. "What have I done?" The silence that followed Elijah's declaration seemed to stretch into infinity. The red handprint on his cheek stood in stark contrast against his brown skin, a visual testament to what had just occurred. Rachel took an instinctive step back, her face transitioning from righteous anger to dawning horror. You were," she stammered, unable to form a coherent response. Elijah continued writing in his notebook, his handwriting remarkably steady despite what had just happened. He documented the time, the exact words exchanged, the names of witnesses he could identify, all with the precision of someone much older than 10. But despite this outward composure, his breathing had quickened, and occasionally his pen hesitated mid-word as his body processed the shock. These small tells, visible only to the most observant witnesses, revealed the vulnerable child beneath the methodical documentation. "You're lying," Rachel finally managed, her voice a desperate whisper. "You're making this up." Without looking up from his documentation, Elijah reached into his messenger bag and removed a sealed envelope with the airline's logo and a distinctive red border. He placed it on his tray table. "This is a Level Alpha Protocol envelope," he said calmly, though his voice caught slightly on the word protocol. "It contains documentation regarding my travel status and emergency contact information. It's provided to certain passengers as a security measure." Sofia Rodriguez stepped forward, gently taking the envelope from the tray table. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it. Inside was an official airline document with gold embossing on the letterhead, signed by the airline's chief operations officer. Sophia's face paled as she read. "Rachel," she whispered, "this is real. This is a priority platinum passenger. There's a direct line to executive offices and, oh my God." Rachel grabbed the document from Sophia's hands, her eyes scanning frantically for some evidence of forgery, some indication that this was an elaborate hoax. There was none. I didn't know," Rachel said, her voice suddenly small. "That is evident," Elijah replied, still writing, "but ignorance doesn't excuse assault." William Hayes had pulled out his phone and was openly recording now. "Young man, do you need medical attention? That hit was substantial." Elijah touched his cheek gently, wincing at the contact. For just a moment, his composed facade cracked entirely, his eyes welling with tears, his lower lip trembling, the shock and pain finally registering fully. He blinked rapidly, took a deep breath, and visibly pulled himself back together with remarkable self-control. "I believe it will bruise, which should be documented for the record, but I don't require immediate medical intervention. Thank you, sir." The composure with which he assessed his own injury struck Hayes as both admirable and profoundly sad. This was not the first time this child had needed to evaluate his own wounds in the aftermath of adult prejudice. Margaret Taylor spoke up, her voice carrying the weight of decades of witnessed injustice. "Child, I have everything recorded from the moment she first approached you. You're not alone." "Thank you, ma'am," Elijah said, finally looking up from his notebook. "Documentation is essential." The elderly judge's words seemed to unlock something in Elijah, the confirmation that adults were witnessing, recording, validating his experience rather than dismissing it. His shoulders relaxed slightly, and a flicker of relief crossed his face, revealing just how much effort his composed response was costing him. Elijah's phone chimed with a notification. He glanced at it briefly. "That would be the emergency alert being received by my family's security team," he said matter-of-factly. "They'll be contacting the airline's executive offices directly. Standard protocol." The methodical way he described what most would consider an extraordinary situation spoke volumes about his life experience. Elijah Jackson, at 10 years old, had protocols for when adults discriminated against him. He had systems in place, responses ready, documentation habits ingrained. Sophia moved to the aircraft intercom. "Captain Taylor, we have a situation in the cabin that requires immediate attention. We'll need to return to the gate." Captain Taylor's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the delay, but we will be returning to the gate. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." The aircraft began to move, taxiing back toward the terminal it had just left. The regular sounds of air travel, the hum of engines, the click of seatbelts, the rustle of magazines, seemed jarringly normal in contrast to the extraordinary situation unfolding in first class. Elijah touched his cheek again, wincing slightly. Then he reached for his phone and pressed a single button, a direct line to his mother. When Dr. Elijah approached gate B12, gripping his boarding pass and steeling himself for what experience had taught him might come next. Flight 307 to New York LaGuardia will begin boarding in 15 minutes, announced the gate agent. We'll start with our first-class passengers, active military personnel, and families with small children. Elijah took a deep breath and stepped toward the priority line, his documentation ready and his grandmother's voice echoing in his mind. Just another day of being 10 years old and black in America. Flight attendant introduction. Rachel's contradictions. Rachel Bennett applied her lipstick with practiced precision, the bright airline-approved red a stark contrast against her pale skin. 15 years as a flight attendant had taught her efficiency in these small routines. Another day, another dollar, she murmured to her reflection, smoothing her blonde hair back into its regulation bun. Amara Jackson answered. Her voice was calm but alert, recognizing the emergency protocol. Elijah? What's happened? Mother, he said, his voice steady until the last word, when it suddenly broke. I've been physically assaulted by a flight attendant on American Airlines Flight 307. He paused, taking a shuddering breath. We're returning to the gate. I've documented the incident and have multiple witnesses, including a former federal judge who recorded video evidence. The crack in his voice, that momentary break in the composed recitation, revealed the child who, despite all his preparation and protocols, was still shaken by having been struck by an adult. Are you hurt, baby? Dr. Jackson asked, her voice both professional and maternal. Contusion to the left cheek, Elijah reported, then added in a smaller voice, It hurts, Mom. I'm on my way, Dr. Jackson said, the controlled fury of a surgeon who could cut with words as precisely as with a scalpel, now evident in her tone. Do not speak to anyone except law enforcement until I arrive. Document everything. You know the protocol. Yes, Mother, Elijah replied, his voice steadier again as the conversation with his mother restored his sense of security and structure. I'm following procedure. The practiced precision of his report broke something in Rachel. This child, this 10-year-old boy, was handling assault with more professionalism than many adults could manage. She had struck him because he didn't fit her image of who belonged in first class. The realization of her own prejudice hit her with sickening clarity. I'm sorry, she whispered, but Elijah wasn't listening to her anymore. He was listening to his mother, taking comfort in the familiar routines of documentation and protocol that had been established precisely for situations like this. Moments when the world proved, yet again, that even the son of a billionaire wasn't exempt from having his dignity violated because of the color of his skin. Passenger intervention. Witnesses take action. As the aircraft door opened, the atmosphere in the first-class cabin crackled with tension. Rachel stood rigidly by the galley, her face ashen. Sofia Rodriguez had positioned herself between Rachel and Elijah, a silent barrier of protection that spoke volumes about where her loyalties now lay. William Hayes unbuckled his seatbelt and stood, his military bearing evident in his posture. At 6 feet 2 inches with the solid build of someone who still maintained combat readiness, his presence commanded attention without him speaking a word. Young man, Hayes said to Elijah, I'll be providing my contact information for your family's legal team. What happened here was unacceptable. Hayes's directness seemed to comfort Elijah, who nodded gratefully. Thank you, sir. Then, in a moment of childlike vulnerability, he asked, Were you really in the Marines? My uncle was in the Marines. The simple question, so normal, so age-appropriate, created a poignant contrast with the extraordinary situation. Hayes's expression softened. Yes, I was. 2 tours in Afghanistan. Your uncle has my respect. Margaret Taylor had also risen from her seat, her phone still recording. At 78, she moved with the deliberate care of someone whose body had begun to betray her quick mind, but her eyes remained sharp and observant. "I'll be staying with you until your parents arrive," she informed Elijah, her tone brooking no argument. No child should face this situation alone. Airport security personnel appeared at the aircraft door, led by a stern-faced officer whose badge identified him as Supervisor Daniels. "What's the situation here?" Daniels asked, his gaze sweeping the cabin. Rachel stepped forward. "There was a misunderstanding." "Assault," William Hayes corrected firmly. "This flight attendant physically struck this child after repeatedly harassing him about his seat assignment, despite his documentation being in order." Officer Daniels looked skeptical, his eyes moving from Hayes to Elijah, then to Rachel. His expression suggested he was categorizing this as a minor dispute blown out of proportion. "Son, what happened?" Daniels asked Elijah, his tone carrying the slight condescension adults often use with children. Before Elijah could answer, Margaret Taylor stepped into Daniels' line of sight. "Officer, I'm Margaret Taylor, retired federal judge. I witnessed and recorded the entire incident. This child was physically assaulted after being racially profiled. The word racially hung in the air like a grenade with its pin pulled. Several passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. I have video evidence," Margaret continued, holding up her phone. "This flight attendant questioned the child's right to be in first class, despite his documentation being repeatedly verified, then struck him across the face when he attempted to call his parents." Jordan Whitaker finally spoke up. As the 42-year-old CEO of Pinnacle Software, he was accustomed to boardroom confrontations, but had found himself frozen in indecision during the incident. "I also witnessed the entire event," Whitaker said, standing. "The child did nothing to provoke physical contact. He was polite and composed throughout, even when being inappropriately questioned." Whitaker's discomfort was palpable, the shame of having witnessed discrimination and initially doing nothing. "I should have spoken up sooner," he added, more to himself than to anyone else. "I saw what was happening and didn't intervene until it was too late." More passengers began to speak up. "She hit him hard enough that we heard it in row 5, called a woman from the back of first class. "The kid was just sitting there," added another passenger. Officer Daniels turned to 2 junior officers who had accompanied him. "Secure the scene. This is now a criminal investigation." Rachel's eyes widened as the full implications hit her. "Criminal? But Ma'am, please step away from the child," Daniels instructed firmly. "Peterson, please escort this flight attendant to the terminal security office." As Officer Peterson moved toward Rachel, Sophia stepped forward. "Sir, I'm also a flight attendant on this flight. I witnessed everything and am prepared to provide a statement." The intervention of her colleague, someone Rachel had personally trained, seemed to hit Rachel harder than the security officer's orders. Her face crumpled slightly as she realized there would be no professional solidarity to shield her. "Sophia, please," she whispered, a desperate edge to her voice. "You know me. You know I wouldn't." Sophia's expression was a mixture of disappointment and resolve. "I know what I saw, Rachel. And I've seen you do this before. Question passengers of color in first class. Check their tickets multiple times. I should have said something sooner." William Hayes had moved to stand near Elijah, a protective presence that carried the weight of his military background. "Officer Daniels, this young man has been very composed, but he's still a child who has experienced trauma. I suggest expediting his removal from this environment." Daniels nodded. "We'll need statements from everyone, but we can conduct those in the terminal." "Mr. Dash," he looked at Elijah. "Jackson," Elijah supplied. "Elijah Jackson." Something in Daniels's expression changed at the name, a flicker of recognition. "Mr. Jackson, we'll escort you to a private waiting area where you'll be comfortable until your parents arrive." Margaret Taylor shook her head. "I'll be accompanying him. I don't trust that he'll be properly protected otherwise." The implication that airport security might not adequately safeguard a black child's interests wasn't lost on Daniels, whose jaw tightened slightly. But he nodded. "That's acceptable, Your Honor." As security began organizing the disembarkation, Passengers from other parts of the aircraft had started to notice the commotion. Phones were out, recording, social media already lighting up with fragmentary accounts of what had transpired. A business traveler in row 3 leaned toward his seatmate. "Do you know who Marcus Jackson is? That kid's father? The Horizon Technologies guy? The billionaire?" "Yeah, she picked the wrong kid to mess with." The whispered exchange carried to Rachel, who stood frozen as the implications continued to unfold. Not only had she assaulted a child, she had assaulted the son of one of the most powerful men in America. But even as this practical concern registered, another realization struck her with even greater force. She'd been raised in the same town as Marcus Jackson. They'd attended different schools, she in public, he in private, but she knew his story. The brilliant scholarship student, the tech prodigy who built his first company in his garage, the self-made billionaire who had transformed quantum computing. Jackson's success represented exactly the kind of American dream story Rachel had always admired. Yet when confronted with his son, she had seen not achievement, but entitlement, not belonging, but intrusion. At 45, Rachel took pride in her appearance, still fit, still capable of turning heads in her uniform. The job had aged her in other ways, though, invisible to the mirror, but present in the tightness around her eyes. 3 hours earlier, she'd kissed her sleeping children goodbye. 14-year-old Tyler had inherited his father's brown skin and curly hair, but her blue eyes, a striking combination that made strangers sometimes question if he was really hers. 12-year-old Zoe was lighter skinned than her brother, but darker than Rachel, existing in that in-between space that seemed to confuse people who needed neat racial categories. Rachel loved her children fiercely. She had married Robert Bennett 16 years ago, despite her parents' initial disapproval. "I'm not racist," her mother had said, "but have you thought about how hard it will be for your children?" Rachel had cut her mother off for 6 months after that comment. The cognitive dissonance made her physically ill. Rachel, being escorted from the aircraft, looked back once at Elijah. The red mark on his cheek had begun to darken, the outline of her hand clearly visible against his skin. The visual evidence of what she'd done, the literal imprint of her prejudice, seemed to physically stagger her. "I didn't mean," she began. "Save it for your statement," Officer Peterson interrupted, guiding her firmly toward the exit. As Elijah gathered his belongings, his movements remained methodical and precise. He placed his notebook carefully in his messenger bag, ensuring the pages wouldn't be creased. He straightened his tie, brushed an invisible speck from his blazer. These small rituals of composure, William Hayes recognized, were the actions of someone trying to maintain control in a situation where control had been violently taken from them. "You're doing great, son," Hayes said quietly. "Your parents will be proud of how you've handled this." Something flickered across Elijah's expression, a momentary crack in the carefully maintained composure. For just an instant, Hayes glimpsed the 10-year-old boy beneath the prematurely adult demeanor, a child who had been struck by an adult and was working desperately to hold himself together. "I just want my mom," Elijah whispered, so quietly that only Hayes could hear. The former Marine nodded, placing a gentle hand on the boy's shoulder. "She's on her way. And until she gets here, you have a whole bunch of adults who are going to make sure you're safe. That's a promise." The documentation, building the case. In a quiet corner of the American Airlines Admiral Club lounge, Elijah Jackson sat perfectly straight in an oversized leather chair, his notebook open on the table before him. Around him, a protective circle had formed. William Hayes, standing with military alertness near the entrance. Margaret Taylor seated directly across from him, and airport security officers posted discreetly at a respectful distance. The exclusive lounge, normally reserved for the airline's highest-tier passengers, had been cleared of other travelers to provide privacy. The hushed atmosphere and soft lighting created an almost surreal contrast to the chaos unfolding beyond its doors, where news crews had already begun to gather. Elijah's pen moved methodically across the page as he continued his documentation, the scratch of ballpoint on paper the only sound in the immediate vicinity. His handwriting was precise, almost architectural in its neatness. each letter carefully formed, each paragraph perfectly aligned. This was not his first incident report. Time of physical contact, approximately 9:17 a.m. Central Time, he wrote. Impact, open palm to left cheek with sufficient force to cause immediate redness and potential bruising. Duration of physical contact, approximately 1.5 seconds. He paused, the pen hovering over the paper as his 10-year-old mind searched for the appropriate clinical terms to describe his own assault. A tear splashed onto the page, catching him by surprise. He quickly wiped his face with his sleeve, embarrassed by this breach in his careful composure. "It's okay to cry, you know," Margaret Taylor said gently, observing him with keen eyes that had presided over thousands of cases in federal court. "Documentation doesn't require you to stop being human." Elijah looked up at her, momentarily uncertain how to respond to this permission to be a child rather than a record keeper. Grandma Josephine says dignity doesn't mean not feeling things. It means not letting others determine how you express what you feel. "Your grandmother sounds like a wise woman," Taylor replied with a small smile. "I'd like to meet her someday." "She'd like you," Elijah said with unexpected certainty. "She says former judges make the best witnesses because they understand the difference between observation and interpretation." Taylor chuckled softly. "Smart woman indeed." A staff member approached with a tray bearing an ice pack wrapped in a cloth napkin. "For your cheeks, sir," the attendant said, addressing Elijah with the same deference typically reserved for adult passengers. News of who he was, and who his parents were, had clearly spread through the airport staff. "Thank you," Elijah replied, accepting the ice pack and placing it gently against his face. The cold provided immediate relief to the throbbing heat of the developing bruise. Margaret Taylor observed him with a mixture of admiration and sorrow. "You document very thoroughly," she noted. "Your parents taught you well." "My grandmother, actually," Elijah replied, not looking up from his writing. "She says evidence is power and memory is unreliable." When he'd first started carrying a notebook at age 7, after the tablet incident at school, his classmates had teased him. "What are you, a spy?" They'd laughed. But over time, the notebook had become his shield, his way of transforming frightening encounters with adult prejudice into something he could control. Documented facts. Elijah's phone buzzed with an incoming call. The screen displayed, "Mother," with a photo of Dr. Amara Jackson in surgical scrubs, her expression serious but kind. "Mother," Elijah answered, his voice steady. "I'm in the Admiral Club lounge with security and several witnesses. The situation is contained." Dr. Jackson's voice came through clearly on speakerphone, the controlled precision of a surgeon, evident in every word. "I'm 5 minutes from the airport. Your father is on a video call with his legal team. Are you physically all right?" "Minor contusion to the left cheek," Elijah reported clinically. "No other physical injuries. I've documented the incident, collected witness information, and secured video evidence from multiple sources." There was a brief pause on the line. Then Dr. Jackson's voice softened slightly. "Elijah, are you all right?" For just a moment, Elijah's carefully maintained composure wavered. His pen stopped moving, and he looked down at his notebook, blinking rapidly. "I'm maintaining composure, Mother." Then, in a much smaller voice that made his actual age painfully evident, "It hurts, Mom, and she was so angry at me, and I didn't do anything wrong." The admission, not just of physical pain but of the emotional confusion of being hated for simply existing, broke through the clinical framework he'd been taught to use. In that moment, he wasn't Elijah Jackson, son of a billionaire with protocols for discrimination incidents. He was just a 10-year-old boy who had been struck by an adult and didn't understand why. "I know, baby," Dr. Jackson replied, her voice warm with maternal love despite the professional title she carried. "You didn't do anything wrong. Not one thing. I'll be there very soon. Your father sends his love." As the call ended, William Hayes, observing from his position by the door, marveled at the child's resilience, the way he could move from clinical documentation to vulnerable child and back again, navigating a reality no child should have to face. "Young man," Hayes said after a moment, "I'd like to send my video to your parents' legal team. What's the best way to do that? Elijah looked up, his expression briefly surprised at being consulted rather than managed. There should be a secure upload link in the automated response to the emergency alert. If you check your email after providing your contact information, you'll receive instructions. A soft ping from Margaret Taylor's phone drew her attention. It appears your situation has gone viral, she said, showing Elijah her screen. My granddaughter just texted me. The video I shared with her has over 50,000 views already. Elijah nodded, unsurprised. Digital documentation creates accountability through visibility, he said, quoting what was clearly another lesson from his grandmother. The door opened again, and a security officer entered with an update. Dr. Jackson has arrived, the officer announced. She's being escorted here now. Elijah straightened in his chair, adjusted his tie, and closed his notebook. These small rituals of preparation spoke to how deeply ingrained his response protocols had become. At 10 years old, he had learned to present himself with impeccable composure in situations where many adults would crumble. But as the door opened again and his mother appeared, the practiced composure crumbled entirely. Elijah's face transformed, tears welling in his eyes as he stood up. "Mom," he said, the single syllable conveying everything he'd been holding back. Dr. Amara Jackson crossed the room in quick strides and embraced her son, holding him tightly as he finally allowed himself to cry. Not the quiet, controlled tears of earlier, but the heaving sobs of a child who had been holding himself together through sheer force of will. "I followed protocol," he said between sobs, his face pressed against her shoulder. "I documented everything. I didn't let them see me cry." "I know, baby," Dr. Jackson murmured, stroking his hair. "You did everything right. Everything. I am so proud of you, and so sorry this happened." Just last week, she'd confronted a teacher who had consistently overlooked Tyler's raised hand in math class while calling on white students. "My son deserves the same attention as every other student," she'd insisted to the principal, her voice trembling with protective rage. Yet something shifted in Rachel when she put on her uniform. In the airplane cabin, especially in first class, she found herself scrutinizing passengers of color more carefully, checking their tickets more thoroughly. She never acknowledged this behavior, even to herself. In her mind, she was simply maintaining standards and ensuring security. She checked her watch, still 30 minutes before pre-boarding procedures began for Flight 307 to LaGuardia. Her mind drifted to yesterday's email. Denied again for the senior purser position. 3 times she'd applied, 3 times passed over. For a few precious moments, Elijah was allowed to simply be a child in his mother's arms, protected and comforted, rather than having to protect himself through documentation and composed dignity. The witnesses in the room, Hayes, Taylor, the security officers, all averted their eyes, giving mother and son what privacy they could in this public moment of private pain. Then, gradually, both Elijah and his mother composed themselves, the family resemblance striking as they each straightened their posture and resumed their public faces. Dr. Jackson's examination of the bruise on her son's cheek was both maternal and clinical, her fingers gently assessing the swelling, her eyes cataloging the size and shape of the mark with medical precision. "Second-degree contusion," she noted. "It will darken over the next 12 to 24 hours. We'll document the progression with photographs." Only after completing this assessment did she turn to address the others in the room, her voice carrying the authority of both her medical training and her maternal protection. "I understand you've all been instrumental in protecting my son and documenting this incident," she said. "On behalf of my family, you have our profound gratitude." Her gaze settled on William Hayes. "Mr. Hayes, I believe you intervened directly?" Hayes nodded. "Yes, ma'am, though not as quickly as I should have. You acted when many others would have remained silent," Dr. Jackson replied. "That matters." She turned to Margaret Taylor next. "And Judge Taylor, your video documentation will be invaluable." "The law requires evidence," Taylor replied simply. "I'm merely ensuring it exists." Dr. Jackson nodded her understanding, then looked down at Elijah, who had composed himself again but remained close to his mother's side. We have protocols for a reason, she told him. You followed them perfectly, and now we'll ensure that what happened to you creates accountability, not just for one person, but for the systems that enabled her behavior. The calm determination in her voice made it clear that this incident would not be resolved with apologies or vouchers or quietly settled lawsuits. The Jackson family was preparing for something much more comprehensive, a response that would transform a single act of discrimination into a catalyst for systemic change. Security response. The law steps in. Officer James Daniels had handled airport security at O'Hare for 17 years. He'd seen it all, or so he thought until today. As he stood in the terminal's security office, watching the video playback for the third time, he still couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. On the screen, Rachel Bennett's hand made contact with Elijah Jackson's face with enough force to snap the boy's head to the side. The sound of the slap came through clearly on the recording, as did the collective gasp from the first-class cabin. "Jesus Christ," Daniels muttered, running a hand over his closely cropped hair. "She actually hit the kid." Beside him, Officer Elena Rodriguez nodded grimly. Multiple videos from different angles, all showing the same thing. There's no ambiguity here. The security office had become command central for what was rapidly evolving into a major incident. Representatives from airline management had arrived, ashen-faced and clutching their phones as share prices began to plummet in real time. TSA officials hovered anxiously, concerned about the security implications and potential federal involvement. In a separate room, Rachel Bennett sat alone, staring at her hands as if seeing them for the first time. The enormity of what she had done, striking a child passenger, the son of one of America's most prominent black businessmen, was still sinking in. Her 15-year career, her financial security, potentially even her freedom, all destroyed in a single moment of uncontrolled prejudice. A knock on the security office door preceded the arrival of Thomas Wilson, the airline's Chicago operations director. His normally impeccable appearance showed signs of strain, tie slightly askew, a faint sheen of sweat on his forehead. "Officer Daniels," Wilson began, his voice tightly controlled. "What exactly are we dealing with here?" Daniels gestured to the video playing on the monitor. "Assault on a minor in a federally regulated space, that makes it a federal offense. The FBI has been notified and is sending agents." Wilson blanched. "Federal? Surely this is an internal matter that—" "Internal?" Officer Rodriguez interrupted, her professional demeanor cracking slightly. "Sir, your employee struck a 10-year-old child on camera in front of dozens of witnesses." This stopped being internal the moment her hand made contact with his face. Wilson adjusted his tie nervously. "Of course, you're right. It's just the Jackson family. Do you understand who they are? Marcus Jackson is worth over $8 billion. His company's technology powers half the smartphones in America. This could destroy your airline?" Daniels finished bluntly. "Maybe it should. From what I've seen, this wasn't just an employee losing control. This was systematic harassment based on racial profiling. The videos show Bennett questioning the boy multiple times, despite his documentation being in order." Another knock announced the arrival of Agent Carlos Rivera from the FBI's Civil Rights Division. The federal agent's expression was grave as he introduced himself. "I've reviewed the preliminary evidence," Rivera stated, dispensing with pleasantries. "This case falls under federal jurisdiction due to multiple factors. It occurred on an aircraft, involves interstate commerce, and potentially constitutes a hate crime under federal statutes." Wilson looked like he might be ill. "Hate crime?" "The videos clearly show differential treatment based on the victim's race," Rivera explained dispassionately. Ms. Bennett repeatedly questioned the child's right to be in first class, despite his documentation being verified multiple times. That establishes a pattern of behavior that will be relevant to determining motive. Officer Daniels nodded toward another monitor showing a live feed from the Admiral Club Lounge, where Dr. Amara Jackson could be seen conferring with legal representatives who had arrived with remarkable speed. "The family has already engaged legal counsel," Daniels informed Agent Rivera. and they have former federal judge Margaret Taylor as a primary witness. The door opened again, and a young officer entered with a tablet. "Sir, you need to see this," he said, handing the device to Daniels. The screen showed a social media dashboard with rapidly updating statistics. Videos of the incident had already accumulated over 500,000 views across platforms. Hashtags like #Justice for Elijah and #FlyingWhileBlack were trending nationally. "This has gone viral," Daniels observed unnecessarily. Wilson's phone buzzed with an incoming call. He checked the screen and visibly paled. "It's the CEO," he murmured before stepping aside to answer. As the airline executive moved to a corner for his conversation, Daniels returned his attention to the monitor showing the security office where Rachel Bennett was being held. She had begun to cry, her shoulders shaking as the reality of her situation fully registered. "What's her story?" Rivera asked, nodding toward the screen. 15 years with the airline," Daniels replied, consulting a file. "No previous physical incidents reported, but there's a pattern worth noting. Looking at passenger complaints filed against her over the last 3 years, there's a disproportionate number involving passengers of color, particularly in premium cabins." The door opened again, and a security officer entered with Sofia Rodriguez in tow. The junior flight attendant looked pale but determined. "This is Sofia Rodriguez," Daniels introduced her. She was working the first-class cabin alongside Bennett and witnessed the entire incident. Sofia stepped forward. "I want to make a formal statement," she said firmly. "What Rachel did was inexcusable, and it wasn't isolated. I've seen her question Black and Latino passengers in first class before, checking their tickets multiple times, implying they might be in the wrong seats. It's been a pattern." Rivera nodded. "Ms. Rodriguez, your testimony will be extremely valuable. Are you willing to provide specific dates and details of previous incidents?" "Yes," Sofia replied without hesitation. "I should have spoken up sooner, but I was afraid for my job." "Not anymore." Her words hung in the air, a damning indictment not just of Rachel Bennett's individual behavior, but of a corporate culture that had allowed such patterns to persist unreported and unaddressed. Wilson returned from his phone call, his expression grim. "The CEO is flying in from New York. The board is in emergency session. They want to know if there's any way to resolve this without federal charges." Rivera's response was immediate and unequivocal. "That's not how this works, Mr. Wilson. A child was assaulted on one of your aircraft by one of your employees. There will be a full investigation, and if the evidence supports it, which it certainly appears to, there will be criminal charges." The latest promotion had gone to Melissa Farrington, 10 years her junior, with half her experience but a master's degree Rachel couldn't afford, and connections Rachel didn't have. "It's not fair," she'd complained to Robert last night. The bathroom door swung open, and Sofia Rodriguez entered, already in uniform, her dark hair perfectly coiffed. "Morning, Rachel," Sofia said with a smile. At 28, the junior flight attendant had been with the airline for just 3 years, but was already being fast-tracked for management. Rachel had trained her personally, shown her every trick she knew, and now watched as Sofia sailed past her in the company hierarchy. "Yes! First class. Should be an easy flight. It's not even half-booked." Sofia applied a quick layer of mascara. "Did you hear back about the purser position?" Rachel stiffened slightly. "They went with Melissa." "Oh," Sofia's face fell. "I'm sorry. That's not right. You deserved it." On the monitor showing the Admiral Club Lounge, they could see Elijah Jackson still documenting the incident in his notebook, his mother beside him fielding calls from what appeared to be an expanding team of legal and security professionals. The poised determination of both mother and son stood in stark contrast to the increasingly frantic airline executives. Officer Daniels turned to Agent Rivera. "How do you want to proceed with Bennett?" Rivera considered the question. "She'll be formally arrested and charged with assault on a minor and potential civil rights violations. Given the circumstances, we'll process her here rather than parading her through the terminal in handcuffs." The small mercy was more practical than compassionate. With news crews gathering outside, perp walking a sobbing flight attendant through the airport would only inflame an already volatile situation. In the holding room, Rachel Bennett had stopped crying and now sat in numb silence, occasionally glancing at her phone, where messages from her husband had begun to accumulate. She hadn't answered any of them yet. How could she possibly explain what she had done? How could she tell the father of her biracial children that she had struck a black child for the crime of existing confidently in first class? The cognitive dissonance between her self-image as a protective mother of biracial children and her actions toward Elijah Jackson had created a psychological crisis she was only beginning to comprehend. That crisis would deepen considerably in the coming days as the full weight of legal, personal, and professional consequences settled upon her. In the Admiral Club lounge, Elijah Jackson continued writing in his notebook, documenting the unfolding events with the same careful precision he had shown from the beginning. At 10 years old, he couldn't possibly comprehend the full implications of what his experience would trigger. But as he recorded each detail, each name, each timestamp, he was building the foundation for a transformation that would extend far beyond this one incident, this one airline, or even this one industry. Dr. Amara Jackson's hands were surgeon steady as she photographed the bruise on her son's face. The mark had darkened significantly in the 3 hours since the incident, the clear outline of Rachel Bennett's hand now a deep purple against Elijah's brown skin. Each photo was taken with clinical precision, straight on, left profile, right profile, with a small ruler placed beside the injury to document its exact dimensions. "Turn slightly to the right, Elijah," she instructed, her voice carrying the same calm authority she used in operating rooms. "We need to capture the full extent of the contusion." They were in a private suite at the Peninsula, Chicago, where Dr. Jackson had moved her son after providing initial statements to authorities. The luxury hotel's discreet staff had efficiently created a command center in the penthouse suite, where legal advisors, security personnel, and family representatives now gathered. "That should be sufficient," Dr. Jackson said, reviewing the photographs on her professional-grade camera. "These will be time-stamped and encrypted for the legal team." Elijah nodded, his composure still remarkable despite the events of the morning. The ice pack had reduced some of the swelling, but the handprint remained starkly visible, physical evidence of what had been done to him. "Is Dad still on the line?" he asked, his voice steady but carrying a hint of the child beneath the composed exterior. Dr. Jackson nodded toward the secure video conferencing setup in the adjoining room. "Yes, he's speaking with Alexandra Rivera about legal strategy. He'll want to see you after we finish the documentation." When they'd first arrived at the hotel, Elijah had finally allowed himself a full emotional release, sobbing in his mother's arms for nearly 20 minutes, asking repeatedly what he had done wrong, why the flight attendant had been so angry at him. Dr. Jackson had held him, stroked his hair, assured him he'd done nothing wrong. It was the kind of moment they rarely permitted themselves in public. Raw, unguarded vulnerability that revealed the toll these incidents took on a child forced to maintain adult composure in the face of discrimination. Now, having processed those emotions in private, Elijah had resumed his public face, composed, articulate, focused on the procedural aspects of the response. But Dr. Jackson knew her son well enough to see the small signs of stress, the slight tension in his shoulders, the occasional too rapid blinking, the way he kept touching his bruised cheek when he thought no one was looking. Alexandra Rivera, the Jackson family's lead attorney from Hoffman and Mitchell, had arrived at the hotel within 30 minutes of their own arrival. Her reputation as one of the nation's premier civil rights attorneys was well earned. She had successfully argued 3 cases before the Supreme Court, each resulting in landmark decisions that expanded protections for marginalized communities. Dr. Jackson reviewed the bruise documentation one final time, her physician's mind cataloging the injury, even as her mother's heart raged at its existence. "We'll need to monitor the progression over the next 24 to 48 hours. Bruising typically peaks at 24 hours post-injury." Her clinical approach wasn't emotional detachment, it was strategic precision. Every medical detail would strengthen their case. Every documentation point would build the foundation for what was to come. A gentle knock at the door announced the arrival of Robert Jenkins, the Jackson family's chief of security. The former FBI agent had overseen the family's protection for 7 years, his quiet competence a constant in their often public lives. "Dr. Jackson," he said respectfully, "we've secured all surveillance footage from the airport and aircraft. The airline attempted to restrict access, but Judge Taylor's intervention expedited the process." "Excellent," Dr. Jackson replied. "Has Margaret Taylor's video been properly preserved?" "Yes, ma'am. Multiple secure copies have been created and stored on independent servers. William Hayes's video has also been secured, along with footage from 12 other passengers. We have the incident documented from virtually every angle." Elijah listened to this exchange with the attentiveness of someone who understood its significance. The methodical collection of evidence, the precise documentation of injury, the securing of testimony, these were lessons his parents had taught him from an early age. "Elijah," Dr. Jackson said, turning to her son, "are you ready to speak with your father?" "Yes, mother," Elijah replied, straightening his tie and squaring his shoulders. Small rituals of preparation that spoke volumes about the dignity he had been taught to maintain. They moved to the adjoining room, where a large screen displayed Marcus Jackson's face. Even from halfway around the world, Marcus Jackson's presence was commanding. At 45, he had built Horizon Technologies from a startup in his garage to a global technology leader worth over $30 billion. His innovations in quantum computing and artificial intelligence had transformed multiple industries. But none of that mattered now. The expression on his face was purely that of a father whose child had been harmed. "Elijah," he said, his voice warm despite the anger visible in his eyes. "Let me see." Elijah turned his face to show the bruise. Marcus Jackson's jaw tightened, a muscle working in his cheek as he controlled his reaction. Behind the composed exterior, his rage was visceral, a primal, paternal fury that someone had dared to harm his child. "You maintained your dignity," Marcus said after a moment. "That's what matters most." "Yes, sir," Elijah replied. "I followed the protocols we practiced." The fact that this family had protocols for racial incidents, that they had practiced how to respond when inevitably confronted with prejudice, was itself a devastating commentary on American society. That a billionaire's son still needed such preparation revealed how wealth and status provided no immunity from racism's reach. "Alexandra," Marcus addressed the attorney, who had entered the frame. "What's our position?" Alexandra Rivera adjusted her glasses, her expression serious. "We're pursuing 3 parallel tracks: criminal charges against Bennett, assault on a minor with potential hate crime enhancements, civil litigation against both Bennett personally and the airline for vicarious liability, negligent hiring and supervision, and violation of civil rights, and regulatory action through the Department of Transportation and FAA regarding systematic discrimination in commercial aviation." Marcus nodded. "And our timeline? We'll file the civil complaint tomorrow morning. The criminal process is already underway. The FBI's Civil Rights Division has taken jurisdiction. Regulatory complaints will be filed simultaneously with multiple agencies." Dr. Jackson joined the conversation. "Marcus, this isn't just about Elijah. The documentation patterns reveal systematic issues across the entire airline." "I know," Marcus replied, his expression grim. "That's why this ends now. Not just for our son, but for every child who's ever been made to feel they don't belong somewhere because of their skin color." The determination in his voice was absolute. As they walked through the terminal, Rachel noticed how passengers responded differently to her and Sophia. The younger woman received smiles, lingering glances. Rachel received respectful nods at best, invisibility at worst. 15 years of service, reduced to a background character. A memory surfaced unexpectedly. Her father complaining about affirmative action when he was passed over for promotion at the factory. "They're just checking boxes," he'd said bitterly. Rachel had dismissed it as her father's outdated views, but now, watching Sophia charm everyone effortlessly, while Rachel's career stagnated, something uncomfortable stirred in her chest. On her phone, Rachel saw a text from Tyler. "Mom, can you come to my basketball game Friday? Coach says I might start." She texted back quickly. "Wouldn't miss it for the world, baby. So proud of you." Her love for her son was unconditional, fierce, protective. The pride she felt in his achievements was genuine and deep. Marcus Jackson had built his career disrupting industries that resisted change. Now that same focused intensity would be directed at an industry that had failed to protect his child. "What about public strategy?" Dr. Jackson asked. "The videos are already viral. We need to control the narrative." Marcus considered this. "Transparency with dignity. We release a statement confirming the incident and our intent to pursue all legal remedies. We make it clear this is about accountability and structural change, not just financial compensation." Elijah, who had been listening carefully to this strategic discussion, spoke up. "Father, I think I should make a statement." All eyes turned to him, surprise evident on adult faces not accustomed to being interrupted during strategic planning. "People need to hear from me directly," Elijah explained with remarkable clarity for a 10-year-old. "Not a long interview, just a short statement. If I don't speak, the narrative becomes about what happened to me, not what I did in response. My dignity matters in this story." The adults exchanged glances, recognizing the wisdom in his assessment. This child, who had maintained his composure through an assault, was now applying that same clear-headed analysis to media strategy. Marcus Jackson's expression softened with pride. "You're right, son. Your voice should be heard, on your terms, in a controlled environment, with a prepared statement that you help craft." Alexandra Rivera nodded approvingly. A brief, dignified statement from Elijah would be powerful. It centers his agency rather than his victimhood. "Agreed," Dr. Jackson said. "We'll prepare something appropriate with Elijah's input. One statement, released through our channels, not through media interviews." As the strategy session continued, Elijah returned to his notebook, recording this new phase of the response with the same methodical precision he had applied from the beginning. His documentation now included not just the incident itself, but the systematic response being built around it, the transformation of a personal violation into a catalyst for structural change. Later that evening, when the strategy session had concluded and most of the team had departed, Elijah found himself alone with his parents in the suite's living room. The public faces all three had maintained throughout the day softened in the privacy of family. "How are you really doing, son?" Marcus asked, his voice gentle. Elijah hesitated, then admitted in a small voice, "I keep thinking about what I did wrong, why she was so angry at me." "You did nothing wrong," Dr. Jackson said firmly, sitting beside her son on the sofa. "Nothing. Her reaction was about her issues, not about you." "But why me?" Elijah persisted. "I was just sitting there." Marcus sighed, choosing his words carefully. "Sometimes people have expectations about who belongs in certain spaces. When someone challenges those expectations just by existing, by being themselves in a place where others don't expect to see them, it creates discomfort. Some people respond to that discomfort with anger or even violence." "Because I'm black?" Elijah asked directly. "Yes," his father confirmed, not sugarcoating the reality. "Because you're black, articulate, confident, and in first class, a combination that challenged her assumptions about who belongs in that space." Elijah nodded, absorbing this explanation. "It's happened before, but no one ever hit me. And no one should ever hit you," Dr. Jackson said, her arm around her son's shoulders. "What happened today was assault, and there will be consequences. Not just for her," Elijah said thoughtfully, "for the whole system that let her think it was okay." His parents exchanged glances, struck again by their son's perceptiveness. At 10 years old, he already understood that individual behaviors were shaped and enabled by larger systems, that Rachel Bennett's actions reflected not just her personal prejudice, but institutional failures that had allowed such behavior to persist. "That's exactly right," Marcus confirmed. "And that's why our response isn't just about what happened to you today, but about ensuring it doesn't happen to anyone else tomorrow." The machinery of justice that often moved sluggishly for those without power or resources was now accelerating with the force of the Jackson family behind it. What Rachel Bennett could not have known when she struck Elijah was that she had not simply assaulted a child. She had ignited a response that would reshape an entire industry's approach to race, dignity, and accountability. Airline damage control. Corporate crisis unfolds. The emergency boardroom at American Airlines headquarters had transformed from organized crisis management to barely contained chaos in the span of 4 hours. Coffee cups and half-eaten sandwiches littered the massive table. Discarded printouts of rapidly outdated press statements covered every surface, and the glow of the wall displays showing plummeting stock prices cast an apocalyptic pall over the assembled executives. CEO Frank Roberts paced at the head of the table, his suit jacket discarded, his tie loosened, his normally immaculate silver hair disheveled from repeated stressed gestures. "Give me numbers, people. Where do we stand right now?" David Chen, the CFO, looked up from his laptop with an expression of someone delivering a terminal diagnosis. "Stock down 28% and still falling. We've lost approximately $1.7 billion in market value since trading opened. 3 major institutional investors have called seeking reassurance, and our credit rating is under review for potential downgrade." Victoria Palmer, still monitoring social media metrics, provided her own grim update. Videos of the incident have accumulated over 4.2 million views across platforms. Hashtags calling for boycotts are trending globally, not just nationally. We've recorded 47,000 mentions of cancellations on social media, and our call centers are reporting unprecedented volume. Legal counsel Jennifer Garcia added the final blow. "We've received formal notification that Hoffman and Mitchell will be filing a comprehensive civil rights lawsuit tomorrow morning. Early indications suggest they'll be seeking not just compensatory and punitive damages, but structural remedies requiring federal oversight of our operations." Robert stopped pacing and braced himself against the table, his knuckles white with tension. What exactly does structural remedies mean in practical terms? Garcia's expression was grim. Based on previous Hoffman and Mitchell cases, it likely means court-mandated changes to our hiring practices, training programs, customer service protocols, and complaint processing systems. Potentially years of external monitoring and regular compliance reporting to federal authorities. "Jesus Christ," Roberts muttered. "This is existential." The door opened and General Counsel Richard Goldstein entered, having just returned from an emergency call with the airline's outside litigation firm. His expression did nothing to lift the pall of doom hanging over the room. "The videos are legally devastating," Goldstein announced without preamble. "We have no viable defense. Bennett clearly assaulted the child after a pattern of harassment, all captured from multiple angles. The Jackson family has former federal judge Margaret Taylor as a primary witness, plus a decorated military veteran and at least a dozen other passengers, all corroborating the same sequence of events." "What about Bennett's claim that she felt threatened?" Roberts asked, grasping for any mitigating factor. Goldstein's laugh was hollow. "By a 10-year-old sitting quietly in his assigned seat? No jury in America would buy that, especially with the video evidence showing Elijah's actual behavior. Bennett's own colleagues are contradicting her version of events. Our junior flight attendant, Sofia Rodriguez, has provided a statement to the FBI detailing Bennett's history of similar behavior toward minority passengers." The revelation hit the room like a physical blow. "Our own employee is testifying against us?" Palmer asked incredulously. "She's testifying to the truth," Goldstein corrected sharply. "And before anyone suggests trying to discredit or silence her, let me be absolutely clear. Any attempt to retaliate against Rodriguez would compound our legal problems exponentially." Roberts sank into his chair at the head of the table, the full weight of the crisis visibly settling on his shoulders. "Options. I need options." The Vice President of Operations, Michael Thompson, cleared his throat. "Maybe we could reach out to the Jackson family directly, offer a settlement before this gets worse?" Garcia shook her head. "The Jacksons aren't interested in a settlement. Not at this stage. They've made it clear they're seeking systemic change, not financial compensation." "Everyone has a price," Thompson insisted. "We could offer—" "Marcus Jackson is worth over $30 billion, Chen interrupted. "There's literally no amount of money we could offer that would matter to him." "From a PR perspective," Palmer began cautiously, We need an immediate and unequivocal response. Yet somehow, this maternal devotion existed in the same heart that would soon resent a different black child for daring to occupy space in first class. It's about connections and privilege, Rachel thought, her internal narrative building justifications. The irony that she applied this logic selectively, acknowledging Sophia's Latino heritage as an unfair advantage while never considering how her own whiteness might have benefited her, remains safely below conscious examination. They arrived at Gate B12, where Captain Taylor and First Officer Ramirez were already reviewing weather patterns. "Ladies," Captain Taylor acknowledged with a nod. "Routine flight today." Rachel nodded professionally, already mentally preparing the first-class cabin, where the airline's most valued customers and her most generous tippers would expect perfection. First-class boarding, the initial encounter. First-class passengers may now begin boarding. Bennett must be terminated. We issue an unconditional apology to the Jackson family. We announce a comprehensive review of our training procedures and customer service protocols, with a focus on identifying and eliminating racial bias. "Not enough," Goldstein interjected. "The Jackson family isn't interested in corporate apologies and promises of reviews. They want systemic change, with teeth." "What does that mean exactly?" Roberts demanded. "It means," Goldstein explained, "that we either proactively implement fundamental reforms under federal oversight, or we fight this in court and almost certainly lose more severely. Either way, the American airlines that exist today will be fundamentally transformed by the time this is over." The bluntness of the assessment silenced the room momentarily. Thompson, still resistant to the idea of fundamental change, spoke up again. "This is one incident, one employee who lost control. Why should the entire company be transformed because of one bad apple?" Sarah Johnson, the head of human resources and the only black executive in the room, had been silent until now. Her expression was a careful mask of professional neutrality, but her voice carried an edge when she finally spoke. "One bad apple?" she repeated. "Michael, did you miss the part where our own flight attendant is providing evidence of a pattern? Or the 7 previous complaints against Bennett that we settled with vouchers and form letters? Or the fact that our complaint system doesn't even track racial discrimination as a distinct category from general customer dissatisfaction?" Johnson stood, commanding the room's attention. "This isn't about one employee. It's about systems we've built, or failed to build, that allowed this behavior to continue unchecked until it exploded in public view." The rebuke landed with particular force coming from Johnson, who was known for her measured approach and reluctance to invoke race in corporate discussions. Chen, ever focused on financial implications, broke the silence that followed. "What's our exposure in terms of damages?" Goldstein spread his hands. "Virtually unlimited. Compensatory damages for Elijah's physical and emotional harm would be significant but manageable. Punitive damages, designed to punish corporate misconduct, could reach into the hundreds of millions given our market capitalization. But the real financial impact would come from the structural remedies, implementing new training programs, oversight mechanisms, monitoring systems, plus the reputational damage affecting future bookings." "Could this bankrupt us?" Roberts asked bluntly. The fact that no one immediately dismissed the possibility was answer enough. "This is ridiculous," Thompson protested. "We're talking about a slap, not a serious injury, not a death, just a slap. Are we really going to let this destroy a 95-year-old company?" The room went silent again, his words hanging in the air. Johnson stared at him with an expression of barely contained fury. "A slap," she repeated quietly, "to a 10-year-old child. By an adult in a position of authority, after racially profiling him despite his documentation being in order, captured on video from multiple angles, witnessed by a former federal judge and a decorated veteran, the son of a tech billionaire with unlimited resources and a surgeon wife who documented his injuries with clinical precision." She leaned forward, her voice low but intense. "Do you really not understand the gravity of this situation, Michael? Or are you just unwilling to accept that our failure to address systemic racism might actually have consequences this time? Thompson flushed but said nothing more. The door opened again, and Thomas Reynolds, the director of operations, entered with a tablet displaying a breaking news alert. The Jackson family has released their first official statement. You need to see this now. He placed the tablet on the table and activated the room's main display screen, where the statement appeared. Today, our 10-year-old son Elijah was physically assaulted while traveling as a ticketed first-class passenger on American Airlines Flight 307. The incident, captured on video from multiple angles, occurred after Elijah was repeatedly questioned about his right to be in first class, despite having proper documentation. The assault was the culmination of a pattern of harassment that appears to have been motivated by racial bias. We are pursuing all available legal remedies against both the individual employee and American Airlines as an institution. This is not simply about seeking justice for our son, but about ensuring that no child faces similar treatment, regardless of their race, background, or economic status. The documentation Elijah maintained throughout this incident, along with video evidence and witness testimonies, will form the foundation of comprehensive legal action designed to create structural change within the airline industry. We are not interested in corporate apologies or token gestures, but in meaningful, measurable transformation of policies, practices, and corporate culture. The statement's measured tone somehow made it more devastating than an emotional tirade would have been. This wasn't a family reacting with unfocused outrage. This was a strategic declaration of intent from individuals with the resources and determination to follow through. They're going to war, Palmer said quietly, and they have all the ammunition. Roberts studied the statement, focusing on specific phrases: pattern of harassment, structural change, comprehensive legal action. They're not just coming after Bennett or seeking a settlement. They're coming to fundamentally reshape how we operate. Palmer's phone rang, her direct line that very few people had access to. The caller ID displayed Jordan Whitaker, Pinnacle Software. Victoria Palmer, she answered, putting the call on speaker. Miss Palmer, Jordan Whitaker here, CEO of Pinnacle Software. I'm calling to inform you that effective immediately, Pinnacle is terminating our corporate travel contract with American Airlines. I personally witnessed your employee assault Elijah Jackson, and I find your company's response thus far wholly inadequate. For your records, this represents approximately $3.2 million in annual business. Before Palmer could respond, Whitaker continued, I'll be issuing a public statement within the hour, encouraging other companies to review their relationships with American Airlines in light of today's events. Good day. The line went dead, leaving the room in stunned silence. That's just the beginning, Roberts said after a moment. Corporate contracts will be the first to go. No company wants to be associated with this. We have to do something, Chen insisted, the panic of a financial officer watching a balance sheet implode in real time, evident in his voice. Every minute we delay is costing us millions. Roberts straightened, a decision crystallizing. Sarah, work with legal to draft a comprehensive transformation proposal. I want specific, measurable commitments, not vague promises of doing better. Richard, prepare for my meeting with the board in 1 hour. They need to understand this isn't just a PR crisis, but an existential threat. Victoria, prepare a statement acknowledging the severity of the incident and announcing Bennett's termination. Johnson nodded, already pulling out her laptop. I've been pushing for civil rights audits and bias training overhauls for 3 years. I have draft proposals ready. I know, Roberts acknowledged, a hint of regret in his tone suggesting he should have listened sooner. Implement everything you've recommended, and add whatever else you think necessary. This isn't about minimizing damage anymore. It's about fundamental transformation. Thompson started to protest again, but Roberts cut him off. Either get on board or tender your resignation, Michael. There's no middle ground here. As the executives scrambled to execute these orders, Roberts paused at the door. And someone get me everything we have on Marcus and Amara Jackson. I need to know exactly who we're dealing with. The transformation had already begun, rippling outward from a single moment of violence against a child who had refused to surrender his dignity. What remained to be seen was how far those ripples would reach, and what they would ultimately change. Rachel's perspective. The mirror cracks. Rachel Bennett sat alone in a small conference room at the FBI field office, the institutional beige walls closing in around her. Her uniform, once a source of pride, now felt like a costume from a life that no longer existed. The American Airlines wings pin she'd polished that morning glinted mockingly under the fluorescent lights. On the table before her sat a cup of untouched coffee, long gone cold. Beside it was a stack of printed screenshots from social media, her face captured in the moment of striking Elijah Jackson, an image now seen by millions. The security officers had shown them to her earlier, perhaps hoping the visual evidence would crack through her denial. It had. Elijah Jackson approached the gate, boarding pass and identification ready in hand. The weight of his Horizon Tech prototype tablet felt reassuring in his leather messenger bag, a gift from his father after Elijah had helped identify a user interface flaw that adult engineers had overlooked. Rachel stood at the aircraft door, greeting passengers with her professional smile. From her position, she could observe the entire boarding process while preparing the cabin for departure. Her eyes swept over the priority boarding line, mentally cataloging the familiar types. The silver-haired executive with the worn briefcase, the middle-aged couple with matching luxury luggage, the young tech entrepreneur whose sneakers probably cost more than Rachel's monthly car payment. Then she saw Elijah, standing alone, stepping forward with the practiced confidence of someone who belonged. Something inside Rachel tightened. The door opened, and James Powell, the public defender assigned to her case, entered with a file folder and a grim expression. At 35, Powell had handled hundreds of cases, but none quite like this. A flight attendant facing federal assault charges in a racially charged incident that had captured national attention. "Ms. Bennett," he began, taking a seat across from her, "I've reviewed the initial evidence, and we need to discuss your options realistically." Rachel looked up, her eyes red-rimmed from crying, her makeup long since cried away. "Am I going to prison?" The question came out as a whisper. Powell didn't sugarcoat his response. "The evidence against you is overwhelming. Multiple videos from different angles clearly show you striking a minor after what appears to be targeted harassment based on his race. The FBI's Civil Rights Division is involved, which means potential hate crime enhancements to the assault charges." Rachel flinched at the phrase hate crime, her hands beginning to tremble. I didn't. It wasn't about race." "Then what was it about?" Powell asked, his tone professionally neutral, but his eyes skeptical. "Why did you repeatedly question this child's right to be in first class, despite his documentation being verified multiple times? Why did you physically strike him when he attempted to call his parents?" The direct questions hung in the air between them. Rachel opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again. The rationalizations she'd been constructing in her mind collapsed under the weight of the evidence. "I don't know," she finally admitted, her voice small. "He just seemed out of place. Too composed, too confident for a child that age. It felt wrong somehow." Powell made a note. "Ms. Bennett, I need to be very clear with you. That explanation will not help your case. In fact, it reinforces the perception that you are acting based on racial bias. The idea that a well-dressed, articulate black child doesn't belong in first class." The bluntness of his assessment hit Rachel like a physical blow. The carefully constructed narrative she'd maintained, that she was just doing her job, protecting the airline standards, ensuring security, crumbled entirely. "My children," she whispered, the reality of her situation finally penetrating fully. "They're biracial. How will I explain this to them?" Powell set aside his legal pad, his expression softening slightly. "Miss Bennett, I've been a public defender for 12 years. One thing I've learned is that people can hold contradictory beliefs simultaneously, loving their own children of color, while harboring prejudice against other people of color who exist in spaces where they don't expect to see them. The assessment was devastating in its accuracy. Rachel thought of her children, Tyler with his curly hair and her blue eyes, Zoe with her warm brown skin and quick smile. She loved them fiercely, had defended them against her own parents' subtle racism, had confronted teachers who underestimated them. A memory surfaced with painful clarity. 6 months ago, Tyler had been followed around an electronics store by a security guard who clearly suspected him of potential shoplifting. Rachel had noticed, confronted the guard, demanded to see the manager, insisted on an apology. "He's just a child," she had shouted, her maternal outrage overwhelming. What kind of person suspects a child of stealing just because of how he looks? What kind of person, indeed? The cognitive dissonance was physically painful as Rachel realized she had become exactly the kind of person she had repeatedly confronted for mistreating her own children. She had seen a black child in first class and immediately assumed he didn't belong there, that his presence required extraordinary verification, that his composed dignity was somehow threatening, that his attempt to contact his parents justified physical violence. "Oh God," she murmured, the contradiction finally resolving into horrifying clarity. "What have I done?" Powell returned to his professional demeanor. "Right now we need to focus on your legal situation. You're facing federal charges of assault on a minor with potential hate crime enhancements. The FBI is also investigating whether this incident was part of a pattern of discriminatory behavior." "Pattern?" Rachel echoed, confusion momentarily replacing despair. "Your personnel file shows 7 previous complaints from minority passengers regarding your treatment of them, particularly in premium cabins. The airlines settled these with vouchers and form apologies, but they establish a troubling history that the prosecution will certainly introduce." The revelation stunned Rachel. She remembered some of those complaints. The executive who'd questioned why she checked his first-class ticket 3 times. The family she'd suggested might be more comfortable in economy. The woman whose drink order she'd repeatedly forgotten. At the time, she'd dismissed the complaints as passengers being oversensitive, playing the race card for special treatment. Now, with sickening clarity, she saw the pattern in her own behavior. She had consistently treated passengers of color in premium cabins with greater scrutiny, skepticism, and reduced service quality, all while telling herself she was simply maintaining standards. How many times had she passionately argued with her husband about the subtle racism their children faced? How often had she posted on social media about supporting diversity and inclusion? The disconnect between her public values and private behaviors created a nausea that rose in her throat. "What's going to happen to me?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Powell consulted his notes. "You'll be formally charged tomorrow morning. Given the high-profile nature of the case and the overwhelming evidence, I recommend we pursue a plea agreement. Fighting these charges would likely result in maximum sentencing." "And if I plead guilty?" "Assault on a minor typically carries a sentence of 6 months to 3 years, depending on circumstances. With no prior criminal record and a guilty plea showing remorse, we could potentially secure a sentence at the lower end of that range." Rachel stared down at her hands, the same hands that had struck a child that morning, that had tucked her own children into bed the night before. "Will I lose custody of my children?" The question emerged broken and terrified. Powell sighed. "That would be a separate family court matter, but yes, a conviction for child assault would certainly trigger a custody evaluation. Your husband would likely become the primary custodial parent during your incarceration." The full implications of what she had done continued to unfold, each revelation more devastating than the last. Her career was over. Her freedom was at risk. Her relationship with her own children would be forever altered. All because of a moment of prejudice directed at someone else's child. "There's something else you should be aware of," Powell added, his tone cautious. "Your husband Robert has made a public statement." Rachel's head snapped up. "Robert made a statement? About me?" Powell handed her a printout of a news article. The headline read, "Husband of flight attendant who slapped black child speaks out. I failed to see the prejudice in my own home." With trembling hands, Rachel read her husband's words. I am horrified and heartbroken by my wife's actions. As the father of biracial children, I cannot condone or excuse what she did. I failed to recognize and address the prejudices that must have been growing within our home. While I love my wife, I must stand for what is right. My primary concern now is protecting our children from the fallout of this incident and ensuring they understand that what their mother did was unequivocally wrong. The statement hit Rachel with the force of a physical blow. Robert, her partner of 16 years, the man who had stood beside her through every challenge, was now publicly distancing himself from her. Not out of cruelty, but out of moral necessity, protecting their children and standing for what was right. "He's left me," she whispered, the last pillar of her life crumbling. As the full weight of her actions settled upon her, Rachel remembered something her son Tyler had asked her just weeks ago, after experiencing a racist comment at school. "Mom, how can someone hate me without even knowing me?" She had hugged him fiercely then, assuring him that such people were ignorant, that they had problems within themselves, that he was perfect exactly as he was. She had believed every word she said. Now she sat in an FBI holding room, confronting the devastating realization that she was exactly the kind of person she had promised to protect her children from. Someone who would judge, diminish, and ultimately harm a child simply because of the color of his skin. "Ms. Bennett," Powell said gently, "I strongly recommend you consider psychiatric evaluation as part of our legal strategy.